Tonight, we're going to challenge your mind until it surrenders to sleep. These paradoxes start simple but gradually become so complex that your brain will prefer dreaming to solving them, and that's exactly the point. I've created this 2.5-hour journey through philosophical puzzles specifically to transition you from alertness to deep sleep. The progression mirrors how our brains naturally shut down for the night, moving from clear, logical thinking to the abstract, illogical realm of dreams. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and let these paradoxes guide you where you need to go. The Ship of Theseus, Identity Through Constant Change. Have you ever wondered if you're still the same person you were 10 years ago? Just like our bodies replace cells constantly, the ancient Ship of Theseus paradox asks a question that's kept philosophers awake for thousands of years. This fascinating puzzle dates back to the writings of Plutarch, who first documented the thought experiment about an Athenian ship that was preserved for centuries, with its wooden planks gradually replaced as they rotted away. Picture this. A legendary ship sits in harbor, a monument to great achievements. Over time, workers remove each weathered plank and replace it with fresh timber. Eventually, every single original piece has been swapped out. The question that has haunted philosophers ever since is deceptively simple. Is it still the same ship? The physical structure might look identical, but none of the original materials remain. But wait, the paradox gets even more mind-bending. Imagine someone collected all those discarded original planks and reassembled them into a second ship. Now we have two vessels, one with the continuous history but all new materials, and another with all the original materials but newly assembled. Which one is the real Ship of Theseus? Can both be authentic? Can neither? The ancient Greeks were particularly fascinated by this question. Heraclitus, who lived around 500 BCE, famously observed that you can never step into the same river twice because new waters constantly flow through. This captures the essence of the Ship of Theseus paradox. Identities persist even as their components change. The Stoics later used the paradox to explore how things maintain coherent identities despite constant material flux. What makes this puzzle so compelling is how deeply personal it becomes when we apply it to ourselves. Our bodies undergo a similar process of constant renewal. Most cells in your body today weren't there a decade ago. Your skin cells replace themselves roughly every 27 days. Red blood cells cycle out every 4 months. Even your skeleton, which seems so permanent, completely regenerates approximately every 10 years. Biologically speaking, you're a completely different physical entity than you were as a child, yet somehow you maintain a continuous sense of self. This biological Ship of Theseus happening within us raises profound questions about personal identity. If your physical self has been entirely replaced, what exactly makes you you? Is it your memories? But those change too. We forget things, remember incorrectly, and form new memories constantly. Is it your personality that evolves throughout your life as well? Different philosophical traditions have approached this question in fascinating ways. John Locke, the 17th century British philosopher, argued that personal identity comes from psychological continuity, the chain of memories and experiences that form a continuous narrative. In his view, you're the same person because you remember being that person yesterday, who remembered being that person the day before, creating an unbroken chain. Buddhist philosophy takes an entirely different approach, suggesting that the very concept of a fixed, permanent self is an illusion. The Buddhist doctrine of anatta, no self, embraces the impermanence highlighted by the Ship of Theseus, seeing identity as a constantly flowing process rather than a fixed entity. Thomas Hobbes added another wrinkle to this paradox. He pointed out that if we define the ship purely by its form and function, its shape, design, and purpose, then the replacement ship is clearly the same ship. But if we define it by its material substance, then it cannot be the same ship once all original materials are gone. Modern philosophers have extended the paradox into thought experiments about personal identity. The teleportation problem asks us to imagine a device that scans your entire body atom by atom, destroys the original, and rebuilds an identical copy elsewhere. Would the person who steps out of the teleporter truly be you? They'd have all your memories, personality, and physical characteristics, but is continuity of existence necessary for identity? There's something deeply comforting about contemplating this paradox as you drift toward sleep. Unlike problems that demand immediate solutions, the Ship of Theseus offers a gentle mental playground where contradictions can exist simultaneously. The lack of a definitive answer creates space for your mind to wander, exploring possibilities rather than seeking closure. This is particularly fitting because sleep itself represents a kind of Ship of Theseus paradox for consciousness. Each night, your awareness disassembles and rebuilds itself. Your brain consolidates memories during sleep, literally reconstructing your identity. The person who wakes tomorrow morning will have subtly different neural pathways than the person closing their eyes tonight. Neuroscience has shown that during sleep, your brain actively processes the day's experiences, strengthening important connections while pruning others. Your hippocampus, crucial for memory formation, replays the day's events, transferring temporary memories to more permanent storage in the cortex. This process physically reshapes your brain each night, making sleep a literal reconstruction of the self. What makes the Ship of Theseus paradox so enduring is that it touches on a fundamental aspect of existence: change itself. We live in a universe of constant flux, where atoms cycle through stars, plants, animals, and eventually us. Nothing remains static, yet patterns persist. Our intuition tells us that identity should be fixed and definable, but reality suggests something more fluid. After thousands of years of contemplation by the greatest philosophical minds, we still haven't reached consensus on the Ship of Theseus. Some philosophers argue that identity is primarily about causal continuity, the unbroken chain of cause and effect that links the ship's existence across time. Others focus on functional continuity. As long as it serves the same purpose, it maintains the same identity. Still others suggest that identity might be fundamentally conventional rather than objective, a useful fiction we agree upon rather than an absolute truth. The paradox defies simple resolution because it exists at the intersection of language, perception, and reality. Words like same and identity collapse under scrutiny when we try to apply them across time to changing entities. Perhaps the problem isn't with the ship, but with our categories of thought. This is why the Ship of Theseus makes such perfect pre-sleep contemplation. As your analytical mind begins to surrender to the dream state, it becomes more comfortable with contradiction and fluidity. The rigid categories of waking thought soften, allowing you to hold multiple possibilities simultaneously. Perhaps it is both the same ship and not the same ship. Perhaps identity itself exists in a space between permanence and change. Zeno's paradoxes, the impossibility of movement. As the boundaries between permanence and change blur in your mind, consider for a moment something we all take for granted: the simple act of movement. Right now, as your body settles more deeply into stillness, ponder this mind-bending thought. What if I told you that according to pure logic, you shouldn't even be able to walk across a room? This seemingly absurd conclusion comes from Zeno of Elea, a Greek philosopher from the 5th century BCE, whose paradoxes have perplexed the greatest minds for over 2,000 years. Zeno wasn't just creating puzzles for entertainment. His paradoxes served a specific purpose: to support the teachings of his mentor, Parmenides, who argued that reality is fundamentally unchanging and that our perceptions of motion and change are merely illusions. This radical perspective challenged the very foundations of how ancient Greeks understood the world. Let's start with Zeno's dichotomy paradox, which questions the possibility of ever completing any journey. Imagine you want to walk across your bedroom. Before you can reach the opposite wall, you must first reach the halfway point. But before reaching that halfway point, you need to reach the quarter point, and before the quarter point, the eighth point, and so on infinitely. Since there are infinitely many points to cross and you can't complete an infinite number of tasks in finite time, movement should be impossible. Yet we move all the time. You might shift positions as you lie there. Your chest rises and falls with each breath. These everyday experiences directly contradict what Zeno's logic tells us should be impossible. Even more compelling is Zeno's paradox of Achilles and the tortoise. Imagine the legendary swift-footed Achilles racing a tortoise. Being fair, Achilles gives the tortoise a head start. Now, for Achilles to win the race, he must first reach the point where the tortoise started. But by then, the tortoise will have moved forward a bit. So Achilles must then reach this new position. Yet by the time he gets there, the tortoise will have advanced again, creating an infinite series of points Achilles must reach. According to the paradox, Achilles can never overtake the tortoise because he's constantly playing catch-up. The absurdity is obvious. We know faster runners overtake slower ones all the time. The paradox lies in how we think about space, time, and infinity. These perplexing scenarios troubled ancient Greek mathematicians and philosophers who lacked the conceptual framework to resolve them. The Greeks generally viewed infinity with suspicion and discomfort, preferring finite, well-defined concepts. Zeno's paradoxes exposed a fundamental problem in their understanding of continuity, how space and time could be divided infinitely while still forming coherent wholes. What makes these paradoxes so captivating is that they highlight a disconnect between our intuitive understanding of movement and the logical implications of infinitely dividing space and time. We experience movement as fluid and continuous, but when we try to break it down into discrete steps, we encounter these impossible scenarios, as your body grows heavier and your mind drifts toward sleep. There's something soothing about contemplating these ancient puzzles. The apparent contradiction between our lived experience and logical analysis creates a perfect mental limbo, a space where rational thought begins to loosen its grip as sleep approaches. Modern mathematics eventually found a way to resolve Zeno's paradoxes through the development of calculus and the concept of infinite series. The key insight was recognizing that some infinite series can converge to a finite sum. Think about the distances in the dichotomy paradox: half, quarter, eighth, and so on. If we add these fractions together, 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8, they approach but never exceed 1. This means that despite involving infinite steps, the total distance remains finite and can be traversed in finite time. This mathematical framework allows us to reconcile the seemingly contradictory ideas about motion and infinity. Yes, there are infinitely many points to cross, but the sum of time required converges to a finite value, making movement possible. What appeared to be an insurmountable logical barrier was eventually resolved through mathematical innovation. The resolution of Zeno's paradoxes demonstrates how mathematical insights can bridge the gap between our intuitive understanding of the world and the logical implications of our concepts. This intellectual journey from paradox to resolution mirrors the transition from wakefulness to sleep, a gradual surrender of analytical thought to a more fluid state of consciousness. Interestingly, Zeno's ancient puzzles connect to cutting-edge concepts in modern physics. In quantum mechanics, physicists discuss the smallest possible units of space and time, the Planck length and Planck time, which might suggest that space and time aren't infinitely divisible after all. Perhaps Zeno was onto something when he questioned whether reality could be chopped into endless smaller pieces. As you consider these paradoxes, notice how your perception of your own body's movement changes. The slight adjustments you might make to get comfortable, the rhythm of your breathing. All these movements happen without your conscious analysis of the infinite points in between. Your experience of movement is direct and immediate, bypassing the logical traps Zeno identified. There's something particularly fitting about contemplating the impossibility of movement as you lie still, preparing for sleep. Movement requires energy and intention, while stillness allows for surrender and rest. Zeno's paradoxes invite you to observe the contrast between the logical impossibility of movement and your lived experience of it, a contradiction that becomes more acceptable as sleep approaches and rigid thinking softens. The challenge these paradoxes present to our understanding of time is especially relevant as you transition toward sleep. Time seems to flow differently when we're fully alert compared to when we're drifting off. the continuous nature of time becomes questionable as our perception of it shifts and warps. Are we moving through time, or is time moving through us? These questions become less distinct as sleep approaches, allowing for multiple possibilities to coexist. The liar paradox, when truth becomes impossible. From paradoxes of movement that challenge physical reality, we now turn to a puzzle that undermines something even more essential: our ability to determine what's true. Have you ever considered what happens when truth directly contradicts itself? A Cretan philosopher once crafted a statement so deceptively simple yet so fundamentally unsolvable that it continues to expose the fragile foundations of human reasoning to this day. This statement is false. Just four simple words that create an impossible logical trap. If the statement is true, then it must be false, but if it's false, then it must be true. The sentence circles back on itself endlessly, creating a perfect loop of contradiction that never resolves. Like a mental version of those impossible staircases that always lead back to themselves, this paradox traps your mind in circular reasoning that has no exit. This brain-teasing contradiction has a fascinating history that stretches back to ancient Greece. The original version comes from a philosopher named Epimenides, a Cretan who famously declared, "All Cretans are liars." The problem becomes immediately apparent. If Epimenides is telling the truth, then he must be lying since he himself is Cretan. But if he's lying, then his statement is false, meaning not all Cretans are liars, potentially making his statement true after all. You can see how quickly this gets confusing. What makes this paradox so captivating is its simplicity. It doesn't require complex mathematical formulas or scientific knowledge, just basic understanding of truth and falsity, concepts we use every day without a second thought. Yet this seemingly straightforward distinction breaks down completely when confronted with self-reference. Throughout history, variations of the liar paradox have emerged. Consider the statement, "I am lying right now." If I'm lying when I say I'm lying, then I must be telling the truth. But if I'm telling the truth when I say I'm lying, then I must be lying. Each attempt to determine the truth value sends you spinning through the same circular reasoning. Even more complex versions exist, like, "This statement is unprovable." If you can prove it's unprovable, you've proven it, making the statement false. But if it's false that it's unprovable, then it must be provable. Yet proving it would make it false again. These brain-teasing loops create the perfect mental lullaby as sleep approaches, offering puzzles with no resolution to occupy your thoughts. The influence of the liar paradox extends far beyond philosophy classrooms. It has profoundly shaped modern mathematics and computer science. Kurt Gödel, one of the most important mathematicians of the 20th century, used a variation of this paradox to prove his famous incompleteness theorems. Gödel showed that any sufficiently complex formal system must contain statements that cannot be proven true or false within that system, essentially embedding the liar paradox into the foundations of mathematics itself. This discovery sent shockwaves through the mathematical world. Before Gödel, many mathematicians believed they could eventually develop a complete, consistent system that could prove or disprove any mathematical statement. The liar paradox in Gödel's hands shattered this dream forever, showing that self-reference creates fundamental limitations in any logical system. The paradox challenges our most basic assumptions about logic. We typically assume the law of excluded middle, that a statement must be either true or false, with no third option. The liar paradox suggests this principle isn't universal. Some statements exist in a strange logical limbo, neither fully true nor fully false, or perhaps both simultaneously. This breakdown of binary logic mirrors the way our thoughts begin to function as we drift towards sleep. During the hypnagogic state, that transitional period between wakefulness and sleep, our thinking becomes less linear and more associative. Ideas loop back on themselves, contradictions seem less problematic, and the rigid structures of waking logic begin to dissolve. The liar paradox provides the perfect mental exercise for this transition, as its circular nature mimics the way our thoughts naturally begin to spiral and repeat as consciousness fades. Self-reference creates these logical loops both in paradoxes and in our pre-sleep thought patterns. As you lie in bed, you might catch yourself thinking about the fact that you're thinking, creating a similar recursive pattern. You become aware of your awareness, conscious of your consciousness. This mental loop mirrors the structure of the liar paradox, where a statement refers to itself in a way that creates an endless circle. The paradox also raises profound questions about language and meaning. How can words that make perfect grammatical sense create statements that have no clear truth value? This suggests there might be fundamental limitations to language itself, boundaries beyond which our communication systems break down. Some philosophers have even used the liar paradox to argue that truth itself might be an inconsistent concept, at least when applied to self-referential statements. Throughout history, philosophers have proposed numerous solutions to the liar paradox. Some suggest creating a hierarchy of languages, where statements about truth can only refer to statements in lower-level languages. Others propose alternative logical systems that allow statements to have truth values beyond just true and false. Some even suggest that self-referential statements like, "this statement is false," are simply meaningless, despite their grammatical correctness. Yet, despite thousands of years of effort from some of history's greatest minds, no solution has gained universal acceptance. The liar paradox has stumped both ancient Greek philosophers and modern logicians alike, revealing the limits of human reasoning. This persistent resistance to resolution makes it particularly suited for pre-sleep contemplation. Unlike problems with clear answers that might keep your mind active and alert, the liar paradox offers a puzzle with no solution, perfect for allowing your analytical mind to gradually surrender to sleep's embrace. As you ponder this paradox, you might notice how it affects your own thinking. At first, you try to solve it through standard logical analysis, if this, then that. But as your mind grows more receptive to sleep, you might find yourself accepting the contradiction rather than fighting it. This shift from problem-solving to acceptance mirrors the broader transition from wake to sleep, where we gradually relinquish conscious control. The beauty of the liar paradox lies in its demonstration that even our most fundamental tools for understanding reality, logic and language, have limitations. Just as Zeno's paradoxes revealed the strange nature of space and time, the liar paradox exposes the boundaries of truth itself. These limitations aren't failures of human understanding, but windows into deeper mysteries about the nature of reality and knowledge. Visual paradoxes, when seeing isn't believing. While language can deceive our logical mind, our visual system is equally susceptible to manipulation. What if I told you there's a triangle that appears perfectly normal from each section, yet forms an object that simply cannot exist in our three-dimensional world? The Penrose triangle stands at that fascinating boundary between reality and illusion, creating the perfect transition as your conscious mind prepares to surrender to dream logic. The story of this impossible shape begins back in 1934 with Swedish artist Oscar Reuterswärd, though it wouldn't gain widespread recognition until mathematician Roger Penrose popularized it in the 1950s. What makes this visual paradox so captivating is how it perfectly follows the rules of perspective in each individual section, while creating something that defies physical reality when viewed as a whole. Your brain processes each corner of the triangle separately, accepting each as valid, but when it attempts to integrate these pieces into a coherent three-dimensional object, the spatial logic collapses. This is where visual paradoxes differ from the logical ones we've explored earlier. Instead of challenging our reasoning abilities, they exploit the assumptions our visual system makes about the world. Your brain has evolved to make rapid judgments about three-dimensional space based on two-dimensional retinal images. When confronted with the Penrose triangle, your visual cortex attempts to apply its standard rules for interpreting perspective, shadows, and spatial relationships. But these very rules are being deliberately manipulated to create the impossible. The effect is similar to what happens when you first begin drifting towards sleep. Your visual processing system, normally so reliable in waking life, begins to accept increasingly unusual and physically impossible scenarios. In both cases, the analytical part of your brain that would normally reject such impossibilities begins to quiet down, allowing contradictory information to coexist. No discussion of visual paradoxes would be complete without mentioning the Dutch graphic artist M.C. Escher, who elevated these visual impossibilities into high art. His famous work, Ascending and Descending, features a staircase that appears to continuously ascend or descend in a perpetual loop, a physical impossibility that nonetheless appears convincing on paper. Monks climb endlessly, never reaching a destination, caught in a visual trap that challenges our most basic understanding of gravity and direction. What's fascinating about these visual puzzles from a neurological perspective is how they create a form of cognitive dissonance. When you stare at the Penrose triangle, specific areas of your brain associated with visual processing become highly activated as they struggle to reconcile the conflicting information. This neural activity bears striking similarities to what happens during dream states, where impossible scenarios are accepted without question. Your brain essentially practices the kind of flexible thinking that dreams require, where stairs can lead both up and down simultaneously, and triangles can exist in configurations that defy physical laws. This is why contemplating visual paradoxes can be particularly effective as you transition towards sleep. The part of your brain responsible for critical analysis, the prefrontal cortex, gradually reduces its activity as you approach sleep. Meanwhile, visual processing regions remain active during this transition, creating the perfect conditions for experiencing and accepting impossible imagery. Architects and artists have long understood the powerful effect these visual paradoxes have on our perception. Beyond Escher, contemporary architects like Frank Gehry design buildings with seemingly impossible angles and perspectives that challenge our spatial expectations. Some theme parks and museums feature rooms specifically designed to create optical illusions, where water appears to flow uphill or people seem to change size as they move across a room. These spaces create a disorienting but fascinating experience that pulls us out of our ordinary perception of reality. The Penrose Triangle and similar impossibilities have found their way into popular culture too. You might recognize variations in logos, album covers, or movie scenes where directors deliberately employ visual paradoxes to create a sense of disorientation or to symbolize a character's changing perception of reality. These images stick with us precisely because they create that gentle cognitive friction, the feeling that something isn't quite right, even though we can't immediately identify what's wrong. What makes these visual paradoxes particularly suitable for pre-sleep contemplation is that they gently challenge your perception without requiring the kind of rigorous logical analysis needed for paradoxes like Zeno's or the liar paradox. You can simply observe the impossible triangle, let your mind wander around its contradictory angles, and experience the pleasant confusion that results. This state of mild perceptual confusion mirrors what happens naturally as your brain transitions from waking consciousness to dreams. In dreams, we regularly accept scenarios that would be immediately rejected by our waking minds, flying without wings, transforming from one person to another, or visiting places that combine features of multiple locations we know. The visual paradoxes we're discussing serve as a perfect bridge between these two states of consciousness, training your mind to loosen its grip on rigid physical laws while maintaining a sense of pattern and structure. Researchers studying the neuroscience of optical illusions have found that when we encounter visual paradoxes, our brains engage in a fascinating dance between bottom-up processing, the raw visual information coming in, and top-down processing, our expectations and prior knowledge. It's in this tension between what we see and what we know to be possible that the paradox exists, much like the tension between wakefulness and dreaming, where one state gradually gives way to the other. By contemplating these impossible objects as you prepare for sleep, you're essentially practicing the kind of mental flexibility that dreaming requires. You're allowing contradictions to exist without needing to resolve them, accepting impossibilities as interesting rather than problematic. This mental stance, curious acceptance rather than rigid analysis, creates the ideal conditions for the transition into sleep and the dream state that follows. The paradox of choice, when more options lead to less happiness. The mental flexibility we develop by accepting visual paradoxes actually faces a completely different challenge in our everyday lives. While our minds can find peace in embracing the impossible Penrose triangle, they often experience profound discomfort when confronted with something seemingly positive. Too many options. Ever caught yourself staring blankly at your streaming service's endless catalog, overwhelmed by thousands of choices, only to give up and rewatch something familiar? This phenomenon has a name, the paradox of choice, and it reveals something deeply counterintuitive about human happiness. Psychologist Barry Schwartz popularized this concept, challenging our cultural assumption that more choices equals more freedom equals more happiness. His research revealed something surprising. An abundance of options often leads not to liberation, but to anxiety, indecision, and ultimately dissatisfaction. Picture yourself at a modern supermarket with 175 different salad dressings. Initially, this variety seems wonderful. Surely one of these options will perfectly match your taste. But as you stand there comparing bottles, a strange thing happens. The decision becomes stressful. You worry about making the wrong choice, and whatever you eventually select, you're likely to wonder if another option would have been better. This mental burden shows up in countless everyday situations. Think about online dating apps with seemingly infinite potential matches, career paths that branch into countless specializations, or even the simple act of trying to select a restaurant on a night out. What should feel like freedom instead becomes a strange form of psychological torture. The most fascinating aspect of this paradox is that it doesn't just affect our decision-making process. It fundamentally undermines our satisfaction after we've made a choice. When faced with numerous alternatives, we become hyper-aware of all the options we didn't select. This awareness of opportunity costs makes us second-guess ourselves and diminishes our enjoyment of whatever we ultimately chose. Schwartz's research identified two distinct decision-making personalities that experience this paradox differently. Maximizers strive to make the absolute best choice possible, exhaustively researching options and comparing features before deciding. Satisficers, by contrast, establish criteria for what would be good enough and select the first option that meets those standards. You might assume maximizers get better results from all their effort, but the research shows the opposite. Satisficers typically report greater happiness and less regret with their decisions than maximizers, who often remain plagued by thoughts of what if and if only. The maximizer might find a marginally better option through their extensive search, but this small improvement comes at a significant psychological cost. The paradox becomes especially relevant as we transition towards sleep. Think about how many of us scroll through streaming services, social media feeds, or news articles before bed. Each scroll presents new options competing for our attention, keeping our decision-making apparatus engaged when it needs to power down. Our minds need to release the constant evaluation of possibilities to enter the sleep state, yet modern technology keeps presenting us with endless choices right up until we attempt to rest. This paradox extends beyond consumer choices to fundamental life decisions. Consider how previous generations often had more defined paths, specific careers, predictable relationship trajectories, and clearer societal expectations. While these limitations certainly restricted freedom in harmful ways, they also provided structure that simplified decision-making. Today, we face unprecedented freedom to define our own paths, which is liberating but also exhausting. Each day presents countless small decisions: which brand of toothpaste, which coffee shop, alongside life-altering ones: which career, which city, which relationship. The cumulative weight of these choices creates what psychologists call decision fatigue, the deteriorating quality of decisions after making many of them. This mental fatigue explains why tech executives like Steve Jobs wore the same outfit daily and why successful restaurants often have limited menus. By eliminating unnecessary choices, they conserved mental energy for decisions that truly mattered. The most profound implication of the paradox of choice is how it challenges our cultural narrative about freedom and happiness. We've built societies that maximize individual choice in almost every domain, from consumer goods to lifestyles. Yet the research suggests that beyond a certain threshold, additional options don't enhance well-being, they actively diminish it. So what's the solution? We can't and shouldn't eliminate choice entirely, but we can practice strategic limitation. Creating personal decision frameworks, like having a default breakfast or a capsule wardrobe, conserves mental energy. Setting time limits for decisions prevents endless deliberation. Most importantly, practicing gratitude for what we've chosen rather than ruminating on alternatives increases satisfaction. Consider implementing what some call the good enough principle. Rather than seeking the absolute best option, define reasonable criteria and select the first choice that satisfies them. This approach doesn't mean settling for mediocrity, but recognizing that the perfect can become the enemy of the good. The streaming service dilemma provides a perfect example. Instead of browsing endlessly, try limiting yourself to 3 options, setting a 5-minute decision timer, or taking turns with family members choosing what to watch. These simple boundaries often lead to greater enjoyment than unlimited choice. The peace we find in accepting visual paradoxes like the Penrose triangle comes from surrendering our need to resolve contradictions. Similarly, we find peace in decision-making by surrendering the exhausting pursuit of perfect choices. Recognizing that good enough truly is good enough liberates us from the tyranny of excessive options. The grandfather paradox, the impossibility of time travel. Surrendering to visual contradictions brings us peace, but some paradoxes refuse to let our minds rest so easily. Time-based paradoxes take the logical impossibilities we've explored and stretch them across the timeline of our existence itself. What if you built a time machine, traveled to the past, and prevented your grandparents from ever meeting? In that moment, you'd create the ultimate logical impossibility. If you were never born, how could you have traveled back to interfere in the first place? This temporal knot that challenges even the most basic principles of cause and effect has kept physicists, philosophers, and science fiction writers debating for over a century. The grandfather paradox represents the quintessential time travel contradiction. Imagine you're frustrated with your existence and decide to erase it by traveling back in time to prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother. If you succeed in this temporal sabotage, you would never be conceived, your parent would never exist, and consequently, neither would you. But here's where the paradox emerges. If you never existed, how could you have traveled back in time to prevent the meeting in the first place? Your very success creates a logical loop that seems to make time travel impossible. This isn't just a quirky thought experiment. It strikes at fundamental principles of causality that govern our understanding of reality. In our everyday experience, causes always precede effects. You can't feel pain from a cut before you actually get cut. You can't read the end of a book before turning to that page. Effects follow causes in a reliable linear progression. The grandfather paradox throws this certainty into chaos by suggesting a scenario where the effect, your time travel, eliminates its own cause, your birth. Scientists and philosophers have proposed several fascinating ways to resolve this apparent contradiction. One popular approach involves parallel universes or branching timelines. Under this model, when you travel back in time and prevent your grandparents' meeting, you're not actually changing your original timeline but creating a new branch of reality. In this new branch, you were never born, but you continue to exist as a traveler from the original timeline. This multiverse theory preserves causality within each individual timeline while allowing for time travelers to move between different branches of reality. Another intriguing approach introduces the concept of closed time-like curves, a mathematical solution in Einstein's theory of general relativity that allows for loops in space-time. If time operates as a closed loop rather than a linear progression, then your actions in the past were always part of history. Your attempt to prevent your grandparents' meeting would inevitably fail because history already accounts for your interference. Perhaps your attempt to separate them actually causes their meeting in some ironic twist of fate. In this view, time travelers don't change the past, they fulfill it. Some physicists take a more straightforward approach and suggest the paradox itself proves that backward time travel must be physically impossible. The universe might have built-in protection mechanisms that prevent causality violations, just as it prevents objects from exceeding the speed of light. These chronology protection mechanisms, as physicist Stephen Hawking called them, would make it physically impossible to create the conditions necessary for time travel to the past. The circular reasoning of the grandfather paradox mirrors the circular thinking patterns many of us experience as we drift towards sleep. Have you noticed how thoughts begin to loop and fold back on themselves as consciousness fades? Your mind might circle around the same idea, examining it from slightly different angles, much like we're examining the logical loop of the time traveler who erases their own existence. This recursive thinking pattern is a natural part of the transition to sleep, making temporal paradoxes particularly suitable for pre-sleep contemplation. Science fiction has explored this paradox extensively, using creative approaches to resolve or embrace the contradiction. H.G. Wells' groundbreaking novel, The Time Machine, cleverly avoided the paradox by having his protagonist travel to the future rather than the past. Later works like Ray Bradbury's A Sound of Thunder introduced the butterfly effect, where tiny changes in the past cascade into massive alterations in the future. Films like Back to the Future visualize timeline changes by having photos gradually fade away as past events are altered, while 12 Monkeys presents a fixed timeline where attempts to change the past were always part of history. More recent movies like Looper, Predestination, and Interstellar play with increasingly complex versions of time travel paradoxes. Christopher Nolan's Tenet introduces the concept of time inversion rather than time travel, creating a different but equally mind-bending set of causal problems. What makes these stories so captivating isn't just the clever plotting, it's how they challenge our fundamental understanding of reality by questioning whether cause must always precede effect. The grandfather paradox also connects to how we experience time subjectively. Our perception of time isn't always linear. Memories can make the distant past feel immediate, while anticipation can make the future seem present. Dreams further distort temporal experience, compressing hours into seconds or extending moments into eternities. As you approach sleep, your brain's timekeeping mechanisms begin to lose precision, creating a natural state where paradoxical thinking about time feels increasingly plausible. This loosening of temporal constraints explains why the grandfather paradox makes such a perfect pre-sleep thought experiment. When fully awake, our logical minds insist on resolving contradictions. But as consciousness fades, we become more comfortable holding conflicting ideas simultaneously. The paradox invites your drowsy mind to float between multiple possible resolutions without demanding a definitive answer. You can imagine yourself as both existing and not existing, caught in a loop of causality that has no beginning or end. Physicists continue to debate whether time travel to the past will ever be possible, but they generally agree on one point. If it is possible, reality must work in ways that prevent paradoxes from occurring. Either multiple timelines exist, causality operates in closed loops, or some yet unknown principle preserves the consistency of events. The universe appears to have a strong preference for logical coherence, even if that coherence takes forms we struggle to comprehend. What makes the grandfather paradox so perfectly suited for time travel enthusiasts and pre-sleep contemplation is that it creates an intellectual playground with no wrong answers. Unlike practical problems that demand resolution, this paradox invites open-ended exploration. It engages the imagination while gradually detaching from the rigid constraints of daily logic, exactly the mental transition that prepares the mind for sleep. The circular reasoning mirrors the brain's own circular patterns during sleep onset, creating a natural bridge between waking thought and dream logic. Russell's paradox, when mathematics contradicts itself. While circular time travel loops might make your head spin, there's an even more fundamental contradiction lurking in the very foundations of mathematics itself. When British philosopher Bertrand Russell was working on mathematical principles in the early 20th century, He stumbled upon a question so deceptively simple it would send shockwaves through the mathematical community. The contradiction wasn't about time or physics. It was about the basic building blocks of mathematics itself, sets. The paradox has a wonderfully accessible version known as the barber paradox. Imagine a village with one barber who follows a simple rule. He shaves every man who doesn't shave himself, and only those men. Now ask yourself, does the barber shave himself? If he does shave himself, then by his own rule, he shouldn't be shaving himself. But if he doesn't shave himself, then according to the same rule, he must shave himself. Either way, we reach a contradiction that can't be resolved within the system. This isn't just a fun linguistic puzzle. When translated into formal mathematical language, it becomes even more troubling. Russell formulated it as a question about sets. Consider the set of all sets that don't contain themselves. Does this set contain itself? If it does contain itself, then by definition it shouldn't. If it doesn't contain itself, then it should. The contradiction emerges no matter which path you choose. What makes Russell's discovery so profound is that it wasn't just an interesting curiosity. It threatened the entire structure of mathematics as it was understood at the time. Mathematicians had been working under the assumption that any collection defined by a property could be treated as a set. Russell showed this assumption led to irresolvable contradictions, creating what mathematicians dramatically called the crisis in the foundations. Think about what this meant. Mathematics, the discipline we rely on for absolute certainty and logical rigor, suddenly had a gaping hole in its foundation. It would be like physicists discovering that under certain conditions, gravity sometimes pushes objects apart instead of pulling them together. The entire system needed reconsideration. What makes self-referential paradoxes like Russell's so captivating is that they create perfect logical loops, much like the circular thinking that often emerges as we approach sleep. Our thoughts begin to fold in on themselves, creating patterns that resemble these mathematical conundrums. The brain's transition towards sleep involves increasingly abstract connections, making Russell's paradox particularly suitable for late-night contemplation. The impact of Russell's discovery extended far beyond pure mathematics. In computer science, self-referential definitions can create infinite loops or programming errors. The same fundamental issue appears when a computer program refers to itself in ways that create circularity. Even everyday language contains these potential contradictions when we make statements about statements themselves. Mathematicians didn't simply give up when confronted with Russell's paradox. Instead, they rebuilt their understanding of set theory from the ground up. Ernst Zermelo and Abraham Frankel developed what became known as ZFC. Zermelo-Frankel set theory with the axiom of choice, introducing careful restrictions on what could be considered a set. These restrictions specifically prevented the formation of the problematic sets that led to Russell's paradox. Their approach was revolutionary. Rather than working with an intuitive, unrestricted notion of sets, mathematicians had to create explicit axioms that defined exactly what sets could and couldn't do. It's similar to how complex board games need explicit rule books to prevent logical contradictions from arising during play. The entire foundation of mathematics had to be formalized in a way that specifically avoided these paradoxes. Russell himself attempted to solve the problem through his theory of types, which essentially organized mathematical objects into hierarchies to prevent the kind of self-reference that created the paradox. In this system, a set would always belong to a higher type than its elements, making it impossible for a set to contain itself. As you contemplate Russell's paradox while drifting towards sleep, consider how it challenges our natural assumptions about logical consistency. We instinctively believe that clear definitions should lead to clear answers, yet here's a definition that leads inevitably to contradiction. This mirrors the way our thoughts become increasingly abstract and sometimes contradictory as sleep approaches, when the brain transitions from rigid waking logic to the fluid associations of dream thinking. The beauty of Russell's paradox for pre-sleep contemplation lies in its abstract nature. Unlike practical problems that demand resolution, this mathematical puzzle creates an intellectual playground where contradiction itself becomes the focus. As your conscious mind relaxes its grip on strict logic, these mathematical contradictions feel less like problems to solve and more like interesting patterns to observe. What's particularly fascinating is how this single discovery, a paradox that could be explained in a simple sentence about a village barber, forced the complete restructuring of mathematical foundations. Sometimes the most profound changes come from the simplest questions. Just as Zeno's paradoxes challenged our understanding of physical movement, Russell's paradox challenged the movement of mathematical reasoning itself. The crisis Russell initiated ultimately strengthened mathematics by forcing a more rigorous understanding of its foundations. Sometimes systems need to break before they can be rebuilt stronger. This pattern appears throughout intellectual history, moments of crisis that lead to deeper understanding. The same process happens during sleep as our brains reorganize information, sometimes breaking down established patterns to create new insights. The paradox of tolerance, the limits of open-mindedness. While mathematical paradoxes challenge our logical thinking, the paradox of tolerance confronts something even more personal: our ethical intuitions about fairness and freedom. What if defending tolerance sometimes requires acts that appear intolerant? This philosophical puzzle forces us to question whether any principle, even one as fundamental as tolerance, can be absolute without containing the seeds of its own destruction. Philosopher Karl Popper formulated this paradox in his 1945 book The Open Society and Its Enemies, written as Europe was emerging from the devastation of World War II. Living through this dark period gave Popper a front-row seat to how democratic societies could unwittingly enable their own destruction. He noticed something disturbing: the way fascist movements exploited the very freedoms offered by tolerant societies to gain power and then systematically dismantle those same freedoms. The central contradiction is deceptively simple. If a society practices unlimited tolerance, even toward those who are intolerant, then the intolerant can eventually gain enough power to destroy the tolerance that allowed them to flourish in the first place. But if a society decides to be intolerant toward intolerant views, can it still claim to be truly tolerant? This circular problem creates an almost hypnotic loop for our minds to follow. Popper's solution wasn't symmetric. He suggested that society should claim the right not to tolerate the intolerant. It sounds almost paradoxical itself, being intolerant in the name of tolerance. Yet Popper argued this wasn't a true contradiction, but rather a necessary safeguard. He believed tolerant societies must reserve the right to suppress truly dangerous forms of intolerance, especially when they threaten the very existence of tolerance. The historical context is crucial to understanding this paradox. In the 1920s and 1930s, many democratic European nations tolerated the rise of fascist movements, believing their systems were robust enough to withstand extreme ideologies. This tolerance ultimately backfired as these movements gained power through democratic means and then systematically dismantled democratic institutions. The Weimar Republic in Germany serves as perhaps the most tragic example, where a democratic system's tolerance toward the Nazi Party led to democracy's own destruction. What makes this paradox especially fascinating is how it continues to play out in modern debates about free speech and censorship. When university campuses debate whether to allow controversial speakers, or when social media platforms consider content moderation policies, they're essentially navigating Popper's paradox. Should platforms tolerate speech that actively promotes intolerance? If they restrict such speech, are they undermining the very principles of open discourse they claim to uphold? Critics of Popper's idea raise important questions about implementation. Who exactly gets to decide what counts as intolerant? This subjective judgment could potentially be misused to silence legitimate dissent under the guise of protecting tolerance. There's always a risk that the principle could be weaponized against political opponents rather than genuine threats to a tolerant society. The line between protecting tolerance and becoming the very thing you claim to oppose is remarkably thin. The paradox also has psychological dimensions. Intolerance often springs from fear, ignorance, or perceived threats. Some philosophers argue that addressing these root causes through education and dialogue might be more effective than suppressing intolerant viewpoints. Perhaps true tolerance isn't passive permission, but active engagement with different perspectives, even uncomfortable ones. As your mind drifts closer to sleep, consider how this paradox manifests in your own life. Have you ever found yourself in situations where being completely tolerant would potentially undermine your own values? Maybe in family discussions, workplace interactions, or community settings, where you had to decide whether certain viewpoints crossed a line from acceptable disagreement to harmful intolerance. Different philosophical traditions have approached this paradox with varying solutions. Liberal philosophers typically emphasize procedural safeguards, laws against incitement of violence or discrimination that protect tolerance without directly policing thought. Communitarian thinkers might emphasize shared values that define the boundaries of acceptable discourse within a society. Critical theorists often focus on power dynamics, arguing that tolerance that preserves existing inequalities isn't true tolerance at all. The paradox becomes even more fascinating when we consider real-world case studies. When Germany banned Nazi symbols and Holocaust denial after World War II, was this an appropriate limitation on tolerance to prevent history from repeating itself? Or when social media companies ban certain types of speech, are they rightfully protecting tolerance or overstepping their role as platforms for free expression? One thought experiment illuminates the paradox's practical implications. Imagine a society where the majority votes to end voting rights for minorities. The democratic process would have been used to undermine democracy itself. This circular problem demonstrates how principles like tolerance and democracy contain internal tensions that can't be resolved through simple formulas. As your conscious mind begins transitioning towards sleep, notice how your thinking about this paradox becomes increasingly abstract. The usual sharp boundaries between concepts begin to blur, and you might find yourself considering tolerance not as a fixed principle but as a dynamic process, one that requires constant vigilance and reassessment. This fluidity of thought mirrors how our brains process ethical quandaries during dream states, where rigid categories often dissolve. The paradox of tolerance serves as a reminder that tolerance isn't a passive state, but an active process requiring courage, judgment, and a willingness to engage with difficult questions. It demonstrates that absolute principles often contain internal contradictions, perfect mental puzzles for the transitional state between wakefulness and sleep, where our minds naturally embrace complexity and ambiguity. 10th, Gödel's incompleteness. Theorems, the limits of knowledge. Just as tolerance contains internal contradictions, the bedrock of human knowledge, mathematics, harbors its own impossible puzzle. In 1931, a quiet Austrian logician named Kurt Gödel published a discovery that permanently shattered our dreams of perfect knowledge. Mathematics had always been humanity's most certain form of understanding, a realm where proofs were absolute and truth was clear. But Gödel's incompleteness theorems revealed something profoundly unsettling. In any system complex enough to describe basic arithmetic, there will always exist statements that are true but impossible to prove within that system. Imagine the shockwaves this sent through the intellectual world. For centuries, mathematicians had been searching for complete, consistent systems that could prove or disprove any mathematical statement. They believed that with enough work, every mathematical truth could eventually be derived from basic axioms. Gödel's work crushed this dream in a way no one expected. His proof used an ingenious method of encoding mathematical statements as numbers, essentially allowing mathematics to talk about itself. This self-reference created statements equivalent to, "This statement cannot be proven within this system." If such a statement could be proven, the system would be inconsistent, proving both a statement and its opposite. If it couldn't be proven, then the statement would be true yet unprovable, making the system incomplete. This elegant and devastating proof showed that any formal system capable of expressing arithmetic must choose. It can be consistent or complete, but never both. The implications reach far beyond abstract mathematics. Consider the pursuit of artificial intelligence. We now know that no algorithm, no matter how sophisticated, can encompass all truths about arithmetic. There are fundamental limits to what machines can achieve, just as there are limits to formal human reasoning. This doesn't mean computers aren't incredibly powerful, but rather that certain types of complete knowledge will forever remain beyond their grasp. Think about how this connects to our own minds. If mathematical systems have these inherent limitations, could our consciousness itself contain similar boundaries? Perhaps there are truths about our own minds that we can never formally prove or understand through introspection alone. Our thought processes might contain unprovable truths, mirroring the limitations Gödel discovered in mathematical systems. What makes Gödel's discovery especially fitting for a bedtime contemplation is how it mirrors the transition between wakefulness and sleep. During the day, your conscious mind operates with logical precision, seeking clear answers and consistent reasoning. But as sleep approaches, this rigid logic gives way to something more fluid, a state where contradictions can coexist and impossibilities seem plausible. Your brain begins to embrace the very incompleteness that Gödel proved was inevitable in formal systems. The incompleteness theorems also connect beautifully to other paradoxes we've explored, like the liar paradox with its self-referential statement, "This statement is false." Gödel's unprovable statements create similar logical loops. But while the liar paradox might seem like a clever word trick, Gödel showed that these limitations are baked into the very structure of mathematical reasoning itself. They're not quirks or oversights, they're inevitable features of any system complex enough to describe numbers. The beauty of Gödel's work is that it doesn't diminish mathematics but enriches our understanding of its nature. It reveals mathematics as something more mysterious and profound than a mere tool for calculation. Mathematics contains truths that transcend proof, statements we can recognize as true even though we can't derive them from our starting axioms. This suggests there might be different ways of knowing beyond formal reasoning alone. As your mind drifts closer to sleep, consider how Gödel's theorems challenge our fundamental assumptions about knowledge itself. We often imagine that with enough time and intelligence, everything could eventually be known and proven. But Gödel showed this isn't just practically difficult, it's mathematically impossible. There will always be gaps in our formal understanding, truths that can be glimpsed but never captured through deduction alone. This limitation extends to philosophy of mind and consciousness studies as well. Just as no formal system can completely describe arithmetic, perhaps no theory of consciousness can completely capture the subjective experience of being. There may always remain aspects of awareness that resist formal explanation, not because our theories aren't sophisticated enough, but because complete formal description might be fundamentally impossible. For artificial intelligence researchers, Gödel's theorems serve as both a humbling reminder and a fascinating challenge. They suggest that machine intelligence will always differ from human intelligence in fundamental ways. While AI systems might eventually match or exceed human abilities in many domains, there will always be a qualitative difference between algorithmic reasoning and human understanding, which somehow operates despite these theoretical limitations. The incompleteness theorems have inspired numerous philosophical debates about the nature of truth, knowledge, and the limits of formal systems. Some philosophers see them as evidence that human intuition and understanding must transcend formal algorithms. Others view them as showing that mathematics, like any human endeavor, contains irreducible mystery at its core. Either way, they've become a cornerstone of modern philosophical inquiry about the nature of knowledge itself. As your consciousness begins to fade towards sleep, Gödel's discoveries offer a perfect transitional thought, a recognition that even our most precise thinking contains inevitable gaps and mysteries. The mind approaching sleep naturally begins to accept contradiction and ambiguity, embracing the very incompleteness that Gödel proved mathematically. Your brain shifts from demanding logical consistency to exploring the spaces between provable truths, where dreams begin to form. The paradox of sleep, consciousness in unconsciousness. While your mind explores those spaces between provable truths, you're approaching the strangest paradox of all, one you experience every night but can never directly witness. Have you ever tried to catch yourself in the exact moment of falling asleep? That's the ultimate philosophical puzzle, a state transition you can never consciously observe because the very act of observation prevents the transition itself. It's like a quantum observation problem happening in your own mind. This hypnagogic state, that mysterious threshold between wakefulness and sleep, represents a neurological contradiction that science still struggles to fully understand. During these precious moments, your mind experiences a bizarre blend where you're neither fully conscious nor unconscious. Logical thought gradually dissolves into dreamlike imagery as your brain chemistry shifts. You might experience vivid sensory hallucinations, geometric patterns, faces, voices, as if your mind is testing the waters of dream consciousness before fully diving in. What makes this transition so fascinating is how it mirrors the paradoxes we've been exploring. Just as Gödel showed us there are truths we cannot prove, sleep consciousness represents an experience we cannot directly witness. We know sleep happens, we experience its effects and remember our dreams, but the precise moment of transition remains forever elusive. Even more intriguing is what happens after you cross that threshold. Scientists call one phase of sleep paradoxical sleep for good reason. During REM sleep, your brain exhibits activity patterns remarkably similar to wakefulness, neurons firing rapidly, processing information, creating vivid mental experiences. Yet simultaneously, your body experiences atonia, a temporary paralysis of most voluntary muscles. This creates the perfect paradox, mental activity paired with physical immobility, a state of being both active and inactive at once. This contradiction serves an essential purpose. The paralysis prevents you from physically acting out your dreams, protecting you from potential injury. Imagine if your body responded to every dream action. You'd be jumping out of bed, running around, or worse. Nature solved this problem with an elegant paradox. Let the mind roam free while keeping the body perfectly still. The brain during sleep doesn't just rest, it processes information in ways that differ dramatically from waking thought. Abstract thinking and creativity are actually heightened during sleep, particularly during REM phases. This suggests your sleeping brain makes connections your waking mind might never discover, assembling information into novel patterns and solutions. Many breakthrough ideas throughout history have emerged from dreams precisely because sleep thinking transcends the logical limitations of wakefulness. This paradoxical state raises profound philosophical questions about the nature of awareness itself. What does it mean to be conscious? If you're having rich experiences during dreams, feeling emotions, making decisions, engaging with a complete world, but have no awareness of your physical body or actual surroundings, what kind of consciousness is that? Some philosophers argue that sleep represents a form of consciousness entirely distinct from wakefulness, challenging our traditional notions of what awareness even means. Sleep researchers study this, transition using EEG readings that track brainwave patterns as they shift from alpha waves, relaxed wakefulness, to theta waves, early sleep, and eventually to the delta waves of deep sleep. The moment of transition shows fascinating mixed patterns that reflect the brain's gradual surrender of conscious control. Scientists can observe this transition happening in others, but the subject themselves can never directly experience it. They can only remember being awake and then later remember being asleep, with nothing in between. What's particularly interesting is how contemplating paradoxes before sleep may actually facilitate this transition. Research indicates that engaging with complex ideas like the ones we've explored activates similar brain regions as those engaged during dreaming. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for logical reasoning, gradually reduces its activity as sleep approaches, while more creative and associative parts of the brain increase their activity. By focusing on paradoxes, you're essentially pre-activating the neural pathways that dominate during dream states. This creates a perfect neurological bridge between waking and sleeping consciousness. The mind contemplating something like Russell's paradox or the Ship of Theseus is already practicing the kind of fluid, non-binary thinking that characterizes dreams. In dreams, contradictions don't bother us. You can be both yourself and someone else simultaneously, or be in two places at once. The dream state naturally embraces the both and thinking that paradoxes require, rather than the either-or logic of wakefulness. Unlike waking consciousness, which tends to demand resolution and clarity, dream consciousness thrives on ambiguity and metaphor. It processes information through symbolic connections rather than logical ones. This is why dreams can feel simultaneously meaningful and nonsensical. They operate according to emotional and associative logic rather than causal reasoning. The transition to this state is facilitated by paradoxical thinking, which begins to loosen the rigid structures of waking logic. The relationship between paradoxes and sleep goes deeper than just helping with the transition. Dreams themselves often contain paradoxical elements: impossible architecture like we saw in the Penrose Triangle, identity shifts reminiscent of the Ship of Theseus, or causal loops similar to the grandfather paradox. It's as if the dreaming mind naturally gravitates toward these puzzles, perhaps as a way of processing the contradictions we encounter in waking life. Some sleep researchers suggest that dreams may even help resolve paradoxes on a subconscious level. By allowing contradictory ideas to coexist without the waking mind's demand for resolution, dreams might facilitate unexpected connections and insights. This could explain why complex problems often seem clearer after a good night's sleep. Your dreaming mind continued working on them in ways your conscious mind couldn't. The ultimate paradox of sleep consciousness reveals something profound about human experience. We spend roughly a third of our lives in a state that we can never directly observe or remember in its purest form. Sleep represents a form of existence that is simultaneously part of us yet forever beyond our conscious grasp, a blind spot in our self-knowledge that can never be eliminated, only accepted. The Ship of Theseus, a tale of a vessel's identity. Have you ever wondered if you're still the same person you were as a child? Tonight's first story follows a ship captain named Theseus who faces this question in a most peculiar way. Captain Theseus was known throughout the Seven Seas as one of the most skilled navigators of his time. His magnificent wooden vessel, adorned with intricate carvings and weathered by countless adventures, had carried him through treacherous storms and calm waters alike. The ship wasn't just his transportation, it was his home, his livelihood, and the physical embodiment of his identity as a sailor. The bond between Theseus and his ship ran deeper than most could understand. Every scratch on the deck told a story of a particular voyage. The slight curve in the mast reminded him of the time they survived a hurricane off the coast of Gibraltar. Even the ship's figurehead, a wooden mermaid with eyes that seemed to follow the horizon, had been carved by Theseus himself during his early days at sea. But the ocean is merciless, even to those it seems to favor. Salt water and rough seas gradually took their toll on the beloved vessel. After returning from a particularly difficult journey to distant lands, Theseus noticed that several planks on the port side had begun to rot. With great care, he selected the finest replacement wood he could find and personally oversaw the repairs, ensuring that every new plank matched the original curvature perfectly. This became a pattern as the years passed. Each time Theseus returned to his home harbor, he would discover new sections of his ship that needed attention. A cracked beam here, a splintered railing there. Sometimes it was the figurehead needing restoration after being battered by particularly violent waves. Other times it was the captain's quarters requiring new floorboards after years of pacing during sleepless nights. What Theseus didn't realize was that an elderly shipwright named Argus had been watching this process with great interest. Argus had built ships his entire life but had recently retired due to his failing eyesight. Something about Theseus and his dedication to preserving his vessel sparked an idea in the old man's mind. Each time Theseus discarded original pieces of his ship, Argus would quietly collect them from the harbor refuse. The old shipwright worked slowly in a small workshop hidden behind his modest home. Using techniques passed down through generations, he carefully restored each discarded piece to its former glory, removing salt damage and treating the wood with special oils to preserve it. He numbered each component according to where it had originally fit on Theseus's vessel. After nearly 15 years of this secret project, two significant things happened. First, Theseus realized that he had eventually replaced every single part of his original ship, from the smallest nail to the largest beam. Not a splinter remained from the vessel he had first sailed out on as a young captain. Second, Argus completed his project, assembling all the original pieces into an identical ship, a perfect recreation of Theseus's vessel as it had been before any replacements. One foggy morning, after returning from a year-long expedition, Theseus navigated through the familiar entrance to his home harbor. As the mist parted, he saw something impossible: two identical ships floating side by side at his usual docking space. He rubbed his eyes, thinking the early morning light was playing tricks on him, but the image remained. He guided his vessel to the neighboring dock and secured it before approaching the mysterious second ship with caution. Every detail was identical: the same carvings along the hull, the same arrangement of rope and rigging, even the same pattern of distinctive knots that only he used. It was as though he was looking at his own ship from 15 years ago. A voice called out from behind him. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" It was Argus, his wrinkled face breaking into a smile. The old shipwright explained his project, showing Theseus how he had preserved and reassembled all the original components that had been replaced over the years. The harbor gently rocked both ships, their identical silhouettes creating mirror reflections on the water's surface. Theseus stood between them, utterly confused. He placed one hand on the hull of his current vessel, the one he sailed but contained no original materials, and his other hand on Argus's recreation, composed entirely of original pieces but which had never actually sailed together in this form. "Which one is truly your ship, Captain?" Argus asked softly, not to challenge but from genuine philosophical curiosity. Theseus had no immediate answer. Both felt familiar under his touch. Both contained elements of his identity as a sailor. The question lingered in his mind throughout the day as he inspected both vessels, walking their decks and running his hands along their railings. His contemplation was interrupted by the harbor master, a practical man concerned more with logistics than philosophy. "Captain Theseus," he called, waving his ledger, "I need to know which vessel to charge the docking fee for. Which one is registered as yours?" Forced to make a decision, Theseus asked for time until sunset to consider. As the day's light faded into rich oranges and purples reflected on the harbor water, he sat on the dock between the two ships. He closed his eyes and felt the gentle movement of the waves transmitted through the wood of both vessels. The ship he currently sailed carried none of the original materials, yet it contained the accumulated experiences of all his journeys. Every replacement had been his choice, installed under his direction, each new piece absorbing the stories of subsequent voyages. The reconstructed ship contained all the original materials but held none of the more recent memories or adaptations. As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, Theseus finally understood something profound. The identity of his ship, like his own identity, wasn't contained in the physical materials but in the continuity of experience, in the invisible thread of memory and purpose that connected each iteration to the next. The next morning, Theseus approached the harbor master with his decision. Both ships were his, he explained, but in different ways. The vessel he actively sailed would continue to be his registered ship because it represented the unbroken journey of his life at sea. The reconstructed ship, he declared, would be donated to the Maritime Museum as a testament to the craftsmanship of both himself and Argus. More importantly, it would stand as a physical representation of a question that had no simple answer: what makes something, or someone, maintain their identity through change? Is it the original materials, the continuous function, the accumulated memories, or something more ineffable that persists through transformation? The grandfather's clock, a time traveler's dilemma. If Theseus's puzzle centered on physical identity, our next tale takes us into an even more perplexing territory, one where existence itself hangs in the balance. Time doesn't just transform us, sometimes it creates paradoxes that challenge whether we should exist at all. What would happen if you could travel back in time? This question has puzzled philosophers and scientists for generations, and tonight it comes to life in the story of Alara, a young woman who inherited more than just her grandfather's clock shop. Alara had grown up watching her grandfather's skilled hands bring timepieces back to life. The rhythmic ticking of dozens of clocks had been the soundtrack of her childhood, each one representing hours of meticulous craftsmanship. When her grandfather passed away, he left his entire workshop to her, a cozy space filled with tools polished from decades of use, wooden workbenches smoothed by time, and clocks of every imaginable design. Among the inheritance was one peculiar clock that always caught her attention. Unlike the others that kept perfect time, this one seemed to have a mind of its own. Some days it ran too fast, other days too slow, and occasionally it would stop altogether only to start again without explanation. It was a beautifully crafted piece with an unusual pendulum mechanism and hands that seemed almost fluid in their movement. Her grandfather had always been strangely protective of this clock, never allowing anyone else to attempt repairs. "Some timepieces aren't meant to be fixed," he'd told her once with a cryptic smile. "They simply keep a different kind of time." One evening, as Alara worked late in the shop, the peculiar clock began to chime despite showing just 11:30. The sound wasn't the expected series of chimes, but a single resonant tone that seemed to vibrate through the wooden floors and walls. Drawn to it, Alara approached and noticed something she'd never seen before: tiny engravings around the clock face that seemed to glow with a faint blue light. Following an inexplicable instinct, she reached out and turned the minute hand backward. The room suddenly filled with a swirling mist that emanated from the clock itself. The familiar walls of the workshop began to shift and transform around her, the scent of wood polish and metal fading into something different, cologne she didn't recognize, and the distinct smell of fresh paint. When the mist cleared, Alara found herself standing in what was recognizably her grandfather's workshop, but everything looked newer. The tools were less worn, the walls a different color, and sitting at the main workbench was a young man she recognized instantly from old photographs, her grandfather, no older than 25. "Can I help you?" he asked, looking up from the pocket watch he was repairing. "The shop's technically closed, but I don't remember locking the door." Alara's heart raced as she realized what had happened. Somehow, the clock had sent her back in time, decades before her birth, to when her grandfather was just starting his career. This was years before he would meet her grandmother at a town dance that local legend said determined the course of both their lives. Over the next few days, though no time passed in her present, Alara found herself returning to visit her young grandfather. Each time, she simply turned the hands of the clock backward and focused on when she wanted to go. She was careful at first, claiming to be a fellow clockmaker interested in learning from him. But as their friendship grew, she began to notice subtle changes. Her grandfather, fascinated by her knowledge of techniques he hadn't yet discovered, began inviting her to spend evenings discussing clockmaking rather than attending local social events. With growing horror, Alara realized that one of those missed events was the summer festival where he was supposed to meet her grandmother. One morning, after returning to her own time, Alara reached for the locket she always wore, one containing a tiny photograph of her grandparents on their wedding day. When she opened it, she gasped. The image was fading around the edges, becoming transparent like a developing photograph in reverse. Her grandmother's face was barely visible now, and with a sickening realization, Alara noticed her own hand seemed slightly translucent when held against the light. "If they never meet," she whispered to the empty shop, "I'll never exist. And if I never exist, how could I have traveled back to change things in the first place?" This was the grandfather paradox in its most literal form. Her actions in the past were unraveling the very possibility of her own existence. Yet something didn't make sense. If she had already prevented her grandparents' meeting, shouldn't she have disappeared instantly? The fact that she was still here, even partially, suggested something else was at work. Alara spent a sleepless night contemplating her options. She could stop visiting the past altogether, hoping the timeline would correct itself. Or she could actively try to ensure her grandparents met, perhaps by arranging an accidental encounter. But what if her interference only made things worse? The next evening, determined to fix what she had done, Alara turned the clock's hands and returned to the past one more time. This visit would be her last. She would explain everything to her grandfather and then remove herself from his life, hoping the natural course of events would resume. But when she arrived, she found him already dressed for the festival she knew was happening that night. On his workbench lay a half-finished clock similar to the very one she had used to travel through time. "I'm glad you came," he said, looking up with bright eyes. "I've been working on something inspired by our conversations. You mentioned once that time might not be as linear as we think, that it might loop back on itself or branch into different paths." Alara approached the workbench carefully. "You're going to the festival tonight?" "Of course," he replied, putting on his jacket. "You said something that made me think, if clockmakers only watch time pass rather than experiencing it, what would be the point of measuring it so precisely? There's a dance tonight and I intend to be there." He paused, looking at her with a curious expression. "You know, I never asked your name." "Alara," she said before she could stop herself. His eyes widened slightly. "That's unusual. My mother once told me if I ever had a granddaughter, I should name her Alara, said it came to her in a dream." He laughed. "Isn't that strange? I've never told anyone that before." In that moment, Alara understood. Time wasn't a straight line that could be broken by removing a single link. It was more like the complex mechanism of a clock itself, wheels within wheels, each turning at different rates but ultimately connected in ways that maintain the integrity of the whole. Her grandfather had always been meant to meet that mysterious woman who shared her knowledge of clocks with him, because that woman was Alara herself. Her presence hadn't disrupted the timeline, it had always been part of it. The paradox wasn't a contradiction but a closed loop, perfect in its circularity. As her grandfather left for the festival where he would meet her grandmother, Alara noticed the photograph in her locket was clear again. Her hands were solid once more. She returned to her own time with a new understanding of her inheritance, not just the shop and the tools, but the very mystery of time itself. The Merchant's Trust, two traders at the crossroads. While Alara's journey through time explored paradoxes of existence, sometimes the most profound dilemmas emerge not from time travel but from everyday human interactions. Trust itself can form its own kind of paradox, especially when survival depends on decisions made in moments of uncertainty. In the fading light of dusk on the ancient Silk Road, two merchants are about to discover how the mathematics of cooperation can either doom or save them both. Farid adjusted his turban as he surveyed the crossroads ahead. The sun was beginning to set, painting the dusty paths in amber hues that would soon give way to the dangerous darkness of night. His caravan was small, just 3 camels laden with the finest silks from his homeland in the east. As he approached the junction where the northern and western routes diverged, he noticed another merchant making camp. Tomas had arrived from the southern routes, his 4 mules carrying goods from regions Farid had only heard described in tavern tales. The western merchant looked up with a mixture of wariness and relief at seeing another traveler. They exchanged cautious greetings, both men acutely aware of the region's reputation for banditry and the vulnerability of solitary travelers. "They say 3 bandits attacked a lone merchant just last week," Thomas offered as he fed twigs into his small fire. "A man travels safer with company on these roads." Farid nodded, considering the stranger's words. "Perhaps we could travel together to the next city. 2 caravans might discourage the bandits who prey on these paths." As they set up camp together, each man kept his goods carefully bundled and secured. Neither mentioned the true extent of their merchandise, the unspoken question hanging between them like the smoke from their campfire. How much should they reveal about their actual cargo? Would honesty benefit them both or make one a target for the other's greed? Farid unrolled his sleeping mat while memories of past journeys flickered through his mind. 5 seasons ago, he had trusted a merchant from the northern provinces who had later disappeared in the night, taking Farid's finest indigo silks and leaving behind worthless bundles of common cloth. The betrayal had cost him nearly half a year's profits and left a persistent wariness that colored every new encounter on the road. Across the fire, Thomas sipped from a wooden cup, his eyes occasionally studying Farid's face in the dancing firelight. He recalled the winter journey through the mountain passes when a band of traders had shared their provisions with him after an avalanche delayed their caravan for 6 days. Without that cooperation, none would have survived the bitter cold and dwindling supplies. Yet he also remembered tales of seemingly friendly fellow merchants who were actually scouts for bandit groups, gathering information about valuable cargo before their companions struck. "The night grows cold," Thomas said, breaking the silence as he offered Farid a portion of his bread. "What brings you to these crossroads, friend?" Their conversation remained careful, discussing weather patterns, road conditions, and distant markets without ever revealing the true value of what they carried. Each man understood the calculation taking place. Cooperation would benefit them both through shared protection, but only if neither betrayed the other. The risk of deception hung in the balance against the potential rewards of trust. As the fire burned lower, casting long shadows across their makeshift camp, both merchants found themselves contemplating the same dilemma. If both honestly shared their best goods, they could combine their resources, hire additional guards at the next town, and both profit abundantly. If one concealed their finest merchandise while the other revealed everything, the honest merchant would be at a disadvantage, perhaps even becoming a target. And if both hid their true inventory, they might gain temporary safety but lose the greater opportunity that partnership could bring. "In my homeland," Farid said quietly, "there is a tale of 2 travelers who meet at a desert well. Both are thirsty, but each fears the other might poison the water. Neither drinks until thirst nearly claims them both." Tomas nodded thoughtfully. "We have a similar story in my country. Our grandmothers tell us that trust is like building a bridge. One stone must be laid first, but both sides must eventually meet in the middle." Morning approached with the first hints of pink light touching the eastern horizon. The critical moment had arrived. They would need to pack their goods and decide how much of their true inventory to reveal to one another. Both men moved deliberately, watching the other from the corner of their eyes. Thomas was the first to speak. "Perhaps there is a way to solve our dilemma that doesn't require blind trust or complete suspicion." He reached into one of his packs and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in linen. "This is a sample of my finest silk brocade from Damascus. I have 3 more bundles of similar quality." Farid studied the offered goods, then reached for his own stores. "And this is a measure of my best silk threads, dyed with true royal purple." He hesitated before adding, "I propose we each reveal a small portion of our goods now, and if we reach the caravanserai by midday tomorrow without incident, we show more." "A gradual revealing," Thomas mused, turning the idea over in his mind. "So neither of us must risk everything at once." Their solution was elegant in its simplicity, small revelations building toward greater trust, with each disclosure serving as proof of good faith. By midday, they had shared stories of their families along with another portion of their inventory. By evening, when they reached the safety of the walled trading post, both men had developed a cautious respect that would eventually blossom into a trading partnership spanning decades. What Farid and Tomas discovered through their careful negotiation was a living example of how cooperation can emerge even when self-interest seems to demand suspicion. Their incremental approach to trust, revealing small portions of their inventory over time rather than demanding complete vulnerability at once, created a path to mutual benefit that neither could have achieved alone. As the years passed, their trading houses grew prosperous through their alliance. The story of their first meeting became a lesson passed to apprentice merchants, that sometimes the most valuable skill in trade isn't knowing when to compete, but knowing how to build trust one small exchange at a time. The Tortoise and Achilles, an impossible race. While trust between merchants can be built incrementally, some distances seem impossible to bridge no matter how small they become. In the sun-dappled meadows of ancient Greece, the legendary warrior Achilles finds himself facing an unusual challenger, not another swift-footed soldier, but a wise old tortoise who proposes a race with one simple condition: a modest head start. The tortoise's wrinkled face betrays a hint of mischief as he explains the terms to the confident warrior. "I need only a small advantage," the tortoise says, his voice slow and deliberate. "Once you give me this head start, I will prove that even the mightiest warrior cannot overtake the humblest of creatures." Achilles laughs, his armor gleaming in the afternoon sun. Known throughout Greece for his unmatched speed, he sees this as nothing more than an amusing diversion. What challenge could a tortoise possibly present? He agrees readily, even offering 100 paces as a starting advantage, far more than the tortoise requested. The race is set in a beautiful meadow where tall grass waves gently in the breeze. Wildflowers dot the landscape with splashes of purple and gold, and in the distance an olive grove provides dappled shade. It's a serene setting for what will become a most perplexing competition. Several local shepherds gather to witness this unusual spectacle, settling on a nearby hillside with curious expressions. Once the tortoise waddles to his starting position, the elderly creature turns back to Achilles with surprising confidence. "Before we begin, let me explain why you cannot win," he says. "By the time you reach the point where I started, I will have moved forward. Then you must reach that new position, but by that time I will have advanced again. This will continue without end. You'll always be catching up to where I was, never where I am." Achilles furrows his brow but dismisses the tortoise's logic with another laugh. At the signal from a shepherd boy, the race begins. Achilles stands still, counting the agreed time before his pursuit. The tortoise moves with determined purpose, each step a small victory in its own right. When his waiting period ends, Achilles bursts forward with magnificent speed. His feet barely seem to touch the earth as he races toward the point where the tortoise began. But just as the tortoise predicted, by the time Achilles reaches that spot, his competitor has moved ahead, not by much, but enough to still be leading the race. Achilles increases his pace, quickly reaching the tortoise's second position. Yet again, the slow-moving creature has inched forward. The warrior's confusion grows as he repeatedly closes the gap, only to find the tortoise has crept ahead during his approach. It's as though he's trying to catch yesterday, always approaching but never quite reaching it. "How is this possible?" Achilles calls out, his voice carrying across the meadow. "I am moving many times faster than you." The tortoise doesn't turn his head but responds with unhurried words. "Speed isn't everything, warrior." Between any 2 points lies another point, and between those points, yet another. The distance between us can be divided infinitely, and you must cross each division to reach me. Achilles slows his pace, puzzled by this strange reality. The mathematical elegance of the problem begins to fascinate him more than winning the competition. He watches how the gap between them grows smaller but never disappears completely. Each time he advances, covering half the remaining distance, then half again, and half of that, yet always with some space remaining. The rhythm of the race takes on a hypnotic quality. Achilles' breathing synchronizes with his footfalls as he considers this puzzle of infinite divisions. The shepherds watching from the hillside have grown bored, seeing only a swift warrior who somehow never quite catches up to a tortoise. But Achilles and his competitor have entered a different kind of race altogether, one that challenges not just physical ability but understanding itself. As the afternoon stretches on, Achilles notices how the light changes across the meadow, how shadows lengthen and the breeze carries the scent of thyme and olive. He realizes he's no longer racing to win but to understand. The competition has transformed into a meditation on movement, distance, and the nature of infinity. Eventually, Achilles slows to a walk. "This race has no end," he calls to the tortoise. "You've shown me something I never considered in all my battles and competitions." The tortoise stops and turns, waiting for Achilles to approach. "The question isn't whether you can catch me. Mathematically, you should. The real question is how movement itself is possible if space can be divided endlessly." Together, they make their way to a gnarled olive tree at the edge of the meadow. Sitting in its shade, warrior and tortoise contemplate the paradox they've enacted. The tortoise explains how, in reality, the sum of all those infinite distances between them actually converges to a finite distance, meaning Achilles should be able to catch up. And yet, the tortoise muses, if we truly can divide any distance into infinite smaller distances, how does anyone move from one point to another at all? We would need to cross an infinite number of points in a finite time. Achilles runs his hand along the ground, feeling the individual blades of grass. "Perhaps," he says, "movement isn't what we think it is. Maybe we don't cross each point individually, but move through space continuously." They spend hours beneath the olive tree, their conversation winding through questions of infinity, continuity, and perception. Neither declares victory in the race. Instead, they discover something more valuable, a friendship formed through shared philosophical curiosity. As the sun begins to set, casting long shadows across the meadow, Achilles realizes the tortoise has given him a gift far greater than any competition could offer, a new way of seeing the world, where questions are more valuable than answers, and paradoxes reveal the limitations of human understanding. The stargazer's question, whispers from the silent cosmos. While Achilles pondered infinite divisions on Earth, beyond our atmosphere lies a contradiction of astronomical proportions. If you've ever looked up at a star-filled sky and felt a strange mixture of wonder and loneliness, you're experiencing firsthand the same puzzle that keeps scientists awake at night. In a universe so vast, where are all the voices we should be hearing? In a remote mountain cabin, far from the light pollution of cities, a young astronomer named Lyra has dedicated herself to answering this very question. After inheriting her grandmother's property, Lyra transformed the rustic retreat into a personal observatory, assembling a powerful radio telescope from components she'd been collecting for years. The main dish sits on a wooden platform behind the cabin, its metallic surface gleaming under the moonlight, constantly scanning the heavens for any hint of intelligent communication. The cabin's location is perfect, nestled high in the mountains where the air is thin and clear, offering an unobstructed view of the cosmos. Most nights, Lyra wraps herself in her grandmother's handmade quilts and climbs onto the cabin's flat roof. She brings a thermos of hot tea and her notebook filled with calculations and observations. Her breath forms little clouds in the cold mountain air as she gazes upward, connecting the dots between stars to form the constellations she's known since childhood. Inside, her equipment hums steadily. Computers process the incoming radio waves, filtering through the natural cosmic background radiation, searching for patterns that couldn't occur naturally. Lyra has programmed her system to alert her if anything unusual appears, but so far the only sounds have been the occasional ping of equipment adjusting and the soft whir of cooling fans. Lyra's fascination with the silence of space began in her university days. Her professors taught her about the Drake equation, a formula attempting to calculate the number of active communicative extraterrestrial civilizations in our galaxy. When she runs the numbers, even with conservative estimates, the equation suggests there should be numerous civilizations capable of communication. So why the silence? This question has become her constant companion. Tonight, as she traces Cassiopeia's distinctive W shape with her finger, Lyra contemplates the vastness above her. Our Milky Way alone contains hundreds of billions of stars. Recent discoveries confirm that most stars host planetary systems. With billions of potentially habitable planets just in our galaxy, the mathematical probability of other intelligent life seems overwhelming. Yet as her equipment scans and listens, all she hears is the empty static of cosmic background radiation. Lyra flips through her notebook to a page where she's listed possible explanations for what scientists call the Fermi paradox, the contradiction between the high probability of extraterrestrial civilizations and our lack of contact with them. Perhaps advanced civilizations inevitably destroy themselves shortly after developing the technology capable of communicating across interstellar distances. Maybe the vastness of space makes meaningful communication impossible, signals degrading across light years of empty space. Or what if we're simply looking for the wrong type of signals altogether? There's another possibility that Lyra finds particularly intriguing: the zoo hypothesis. She imagines advanced civilizations intentionally avoiding contact, observing humanity from afar like animals in a cosmic preserve. Perhaps they're waiting for us to reach some developmental milestone before making contact. This thought makes her smile as she scans the sky, wondering if somewhere, someone is looking back. On some nights, the silence of the universe feels profoundly lonely to Lyra. She imagines countless worlds where life emerged, flourished, and perhaps vanished without ever connecting with another intelligent species. The thought of civilizations rising and falling in isolation, separated by the cold vacuum of space, brings a heaviness to her heart. How many brilliant minds might have contemplated the same stars, asking the same questions without ever knowing they weren't alone? But on other nights, like tonight, there's something oddly comforting about the quiet. If humans truly are rare, perhaps that makes our existence all the more precious. Or maybe we're simply early arrivers to the cosmic conversation, one of the first civilizations advanced enough to look outward and wonder. The silence might not be evidence of absence, but of patience, the universe waiting for more voices to join the conversation. Lyra's grandmother used to tell her that questions are often more valuable than answers. The mystery is what keeps us looking up, she'd say. Now, surrounded by equipment designed to solve that mystery, Lyra understands what her grandmother meant. The search itself has shaped her life, giving it purpose and wonder regardless of whether she ever receives an answer. As the night deepens, Lyra's attention is drawn to her monitoring system. A subtle alert flashes on her tablet, an unusual pattern detected in the data stream. Her heart quickens as she abandons her comfortable spot to hurry inside. The signal is faint but structured, repeating in a way that seems non-random. For a moment, she allows herself to believe this could be it, the evidence that humanity isn't alone. Hours pass as Lyra analyzes the signal, comparing it against known cosmic phenomena. Could this pattern be artificial, a deliberate message from another civilization? Or is it merely a natural occurrence she hasn't encountered before? Perhaps neutron stars interacting or some other astrophysical process creating an illusion of order in the chaos? The dawn begins to lighten the eastern sky before Lyra has her answer. The pattern, though unusual, matches a recently documented pulsar with unique rotation characteristics. Not a message from alien intelligence, but a reminder of how much we still have to learn about our universe. She should feel disappointed, but instead finds herself smiling as she steps outside to watch the sunrise. As the first golden rays spill over the distant peaks, Lyra realizes something important. Whether or not other civilizations exist, whether or not humanity ever makes contact with extraterrestrial intelligence, the quest itself has value. Like Achilles and his impossible race with the tortoise, perhaps the beauty lies not in reaching the destination but in the eternal journey of seeking. Lyra carefully shuts down her equipment and prepares for sleep as the world around her awakens. Tomorrow night she'll return to her vigil, continuing the search regardless of the odds. Because in asking the question, in looking up at the stars and wondering, she participates in one of humanity's most profound traditions. From ancient astronomers charting the movements of planets to modern scientists scanning the cosmos with radio telescopes, we have always been creatures who question the darkness and listen for answers. The village trolley, a conductor's choice. As Lyra drifts towards sleep, contemplating the vastness of the cosmos, across town a rail worker named Thomas faces a different kind of infinity. Night after night, the same moral labyrinth awaits him in dreams that feel more real than his waking hours. While the stars may keep their silence, Thomas's conscience speaks volumes in the quietest hours of the night. Thomas has operated the village trolley for nearly 30 years, his weathered hands familiar with every lever and switch along the scenic route that connects the hillside homes to the town center. Villagers set their watches by his punctual arrivals, and generations of children have grown up waving to him from garden fences. Not once in those decades has Thomas experienced anything more dangerous than a minor delay during heavy snowfall. His perfect safety record is the quiet pride of a man who values consistency and care. But in his recurring dream, the peaceful routine fractures. The morning always begins the same way, a light mist hovering over the tracks, the familiar weight of his conductor's cap, and the gentle sway of the trolley as it rounds the bend near Miller's Creek. Thomas hums his usual tune while passengers chat quietly behind him. Then, without warning, the brake lever goes slack in his hand, the familiar resistance suddenly gone. In these dreams, time stretches like taffy as the trolley approaches the fork in the tracks. Ahead, through the thinning fog, Thomas can make out figures working on both paths. On the left track, 5 village maintenance workers clear debris from recent storms. On the right track, a single worker adjusts the rail alignment with careful precision. The trolley's momentum carries it forward relentlessly, and Thomas knows with horrible certainty that he cannot stop in time. The sounds of the world fade until all Thomas hears is the rhythmic clicking of wheels against tracks and his own heartbeat. The clicking seems to ask a question with each rotation: left or right, 5 or 1, act or allow. His hands hover over the track switch lever as seconds expand into what feels like hours. This is the moment where utilitarian calculations crash against something deeper in the human heart, the difference between tragedy and murder hanging in the balance. Thomas sees the choice with brutal clarity. He can do nothing, allowing the trolley to continue on its current path toward the 5 workers, or he can actively divert it toward the lone worker. The outcome would be numerically better if he throws the switch. 1 life lost instead of 5. But the act of throwing that switch would transform him from helpless witness into something else entirely, someone who deliberately directed death toward another person. What makes this dream so haunting isn't just the impossible choice, but how Thomas knows each person on those tracks. On the left, there's Miguel with 3 young children and a talent for carving wooden toys. Beside him works Eleanor, who cares for her elderly mother and organizes the village harvest festival. The others, Samuel, Priya, and Oliver, have their own stories, their own webs of relationships that Thomas can picture with perfect clarity. And on the right track stands Darius, the widower who volunteers at the school teaching mathematics, whose garden produces the sweetest strawberries in the region. Thomas finds himself confronting the most fundamental questions of human morality. Is there a mathematical calculation that can determine the value of a human life? Does intention matter more than outcome? Is there truly a moral difference between acting and allowing something to happen? The philosophical frameworks of utilitarianism and deontological ethics wage war in his mind as the trolley continues its inevitable approach. In some versions of the dream, Thomas reasons that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. He reaches for the switch, feeling the cool metal against his palm, knowing he's choosing to sacrifice 1 to save 5. The weight of that deliberate action settles into his bones. In other iterations, Thomas freezes, unable to take direct action that would cause harm, even to prevent greater tragedy. He becomes a witness rather than a participant in the unfolding disaster. What makes this scenario even more complex is how Thomas understands that neither choice offers moral comfort. If he diverts the trolley, he actively causes 1 death. If he does nothing, he allows 5 deaths he could have prevented. Both actions and inactions carry moral weight. There's no mathematical formula that can calculate the exact ethical value of Darius's life against the combined worth of the other 5 workers. Each person represents an entire universe of experiences, relationships, and possibilities. Sometimes in the dream, Thomas considers a third option, throwing himself in front of the trolley to stop it. But dream physics never allow this solution to work. The trolley is too heavy, his sacrifice futile. The choice remains binary and terrible. As Thomas reaches for the switch lever, his fingers trembling with the burden of playing God, something strange happens. The dream begins to dissolve around the edges, the trolley and tracks becoming transparent as dawnlight filters through his bedroom curtains. Thomas awakens with a start, his pillow damp with sweat, the moral dilemma unresolved once again. Night after night, this dream returns. Thomas has come to understand that his subconscious isn't tormenting him needlessly. It's inviting him to contemplate questions that philosophers have wrestled with for centuries. The trolley problem isn't just a thought experiment, it's a window into our deepest values and the limits of rational moral calculation. Thomas gradually realizes that perhaps these dreams don't demand a resolution, but rather a willingness to sit with profound uncertainty. In his waking hours, Thomas operates his real trolley with renewed appreciation for the preciousness of human life. He performs extra safety checks, moves at cautious speeds through populated areas, and greets each passenger with genuine warmth. The dream has transformed him not by providing an answer, but by teaching him to hold the question with greater compassion. Some nights now, when the dream begins, Thomas doesn't immediately reach for the switch. Instead, he uses the stretch time to look more deeply at each worker, to honor their complexity and dignity. He's learning that moral questions of this magnitude aren't puzzles to be solved, but mysteries to be contemplated. There may not be a correct answer in the traditional sense, only choices made with the fullest awareness and compassion possible. Thomas's dream embodies a paradox at the heart of human morality. We must make choices in a world where perfect knowledge is impossible and where competing values can't always be reconciled. The philosophical traditions that attempt to guide us, whether focused on consequences, duties, or virtues, each capture something true about ethics while missing other dimensions of moral life. The Sandkeeper, guardian of the heap. While Thomas grapples with the paradox of moral boundaries, there exists another guardian facing a different kind of boundary problem altogether. Have you ever wondered exactly when a collection of scattered grains becomes something more significant, not just philosophically, but in the very fabric of existence itself? The Sandkeeper knows this isn't merely an academic question, but one that shapes how we understand reality and perhaps even your journey into sleep tonight. In the space between waking and dreaming stands the Sandkeeper, an ageless entity responsible for maintaining the cosmic hourglass that measures all existence. Neither male nor female, young nor old, the Sandkeeper's form shifts like the dunes they tend, sometimes appearing as a figure draped in flowing robes that shimmer with embedded grains of sand, other times merely as a silhouette against the endless desert of time. Their sole purpose is to ensure the steady flow of sand from the upper chamber to the lower, marking the passage of moments throughout the universe. One ordinary day, though time works differently in the Sandkeeper's realm, they notice something unusual forming at the base of the great hourglass. A small collection of sand grains has accumulated outside the normal flow, creating what might be described as a pile. Or perhaps it's a mound, maybe even a heap. The Sandkeeper pauses, suddenly puzzled by a question that had never before seemed important. Exactly when does a collection of individual sand grains become a heap? Intrigued by this seemingly simple yet profoundly complex question, the Sandkeeper begins an experiment. Taking a perfectly flat obsidian surface that reflects the starlight above, they place a single grain of sand at its center. "This is not a heap," they whisper, their voice like the gentle shifting of sand. They add another grain beside the first. 2 grains, still not a heap. A third grain joins the others, then a fourth, a fifth. The Sandkeeper continues this process with careful precision, adding 1 grain at a time and pausing after each addition to evaluate the result. 10 grains, 20, 50, 100. At what precise moment does this collection transform from not a heap into a heap? The Sandkeeper's brow furrows with growing confusion. Adding a single grain never seems to create this transformation. Each individual addition seems insignificant, unable to cross the threshold from not heap to heap status. Yet somehow, eventually, the sandkeeper looks down to find what anyone would certainly call a heap of sand. If adding one grain to something that is not a heap cannot create a heap, the sandkeeper muses, then how does a heap ever come into existence? They carefully remove one grain from what is clearly a heap. It remains a heap. They remove another, and another. At what exact point does the heap cease to be a heap? The boundary proves impossible to define precisely. As the sandkeeper continues their experiment, the sound of sand grains falling creates a hypnotic rhythm, soft little sounds of each grain landing atop others, building a gentle symphony like distant waves caressing a shore. The sound pulses with a rhythm that seems designed to lull listeners toward tranquility. Each grain makes its own unique sound, yet together they create a soothing white noise that fills the chamber of existence. The sandkeeper begins to see this same boundary question everywhere they look. Mountains form from countless rocks, yet no single rock transforms a not mountain into a mountain. Galaxies swirl into existence from gathering stars, yet no single star marks the transition from cosmic dust to celestial body. A forest emerges from individual trees, yet no one tree creates the threshold where separate plants become an ecosystem. Even in human experience, the sandkeeper realizes this paradox exists. When does a collection of moments become a lifetime? When does a group of people become a community? When does gathering knowledge transform into wisdom? The boundaries between these states remain stubbornly undefined, resistant to precise measurement. Most fascinating of all, the sandkeeper notices this paradox in the transition between wakefulness and sleep. When exactly does consciousness slip into unconsciousness? Is there a precise moment when alertness becomes slumber? The sandkeeper watches humans across the world each night, drifting gradually from full awareness into the embrace of dreams. They cross this threshold every night, yet none could identify the exact instant of transition. The hypnagogic state, that curious liminal space between wakefulness and sleep, particularly interests the sandkeeper. In this transitional realm, humans experience vivid imagery and sensations that blur the boundaries between reality and dreams. Their thoughts drift and transform, becoming increasingly surreal without any clear demarcation point, separating alertness from dreaming. Just as individual grains accumulate to form a heap, small changes in consciousness accumulate until somehow wakefulness has transformed into sleep. Growing increasingly fascinated, the sandkeeper continues adding grain after grain to their experimental pile. They notice how their own perception shifts, sometimes seeing the same collection as a heap when viewed from one angle, yet merely a scattering when viewed from another. The boundary isn't just difficult to define, it's subjective, dependent on perspective and context. Months pass in the outside world as the sandkeeper contemplates this puzzle. They construct and deconstruct countless piles of sand, searching for that elusive moment of transformation. Philosophers throughout human history have grappled with this same paradox, the sandkeeper realizes, calling it the Sorites paradox, from the Greek word soros, meaning heap. For thousands of years, human minds have struggled with the problem of vagueness, with the challenge of defining boundaries between states that change gradually rather than abruptly. Finally, after what might be centuries or merely moments in the sandkeeper's timeless realm, understanding dawns. The sandkeeper realizes that the question itself contains a flawed assumption that there must be a precise boundary between not a heap and a heap. Perhaps some transformations happen without definable boundaries. Perhaps vagueness isn't a problem to be solved, but a fundamental property of reality to be accepted. The sandkeeper stands and lets the sand run through their fingers, watching it cascade into a perfect cone below. They no longer seek the exact grain that creates the transformation. Instead, they find peace in the gradual nature of change itself, in the beautiful continuity of existence where one state flows into another without rigid demarcation. The world isn't made of sharp categories with clear boundaries, but of gentle transitions and liminal spaces where multiple truths can exist simultaneously. This insight brings the Sandkeeper a profound sense of tranquility. They return to tending the cosmic hourglass with renewed purpose, understanding that their role isn't to define or categorize time, but simply to ensure its continuous flow, grain by grain, moment by moment. The boundaries between past, present, and future are as fluid as the boundary between a few grains and a heap, and this fluidity is what makes existence rich with possibility. The crocodile's promise, a parent's impossible choice. At the very edge of dreams, where reality blurs and logic gives way to emotion, there exists a paradox more troubling than any puzzle of sand or time. This is a story about a crocodile who created an impossible trap, one where the stakes weren't philosophical musings, but a child's life hanging in the balance between truth and falsehood. In a village bordered by an ancient river with waters that seemed to whisper secrets of the past, lived a parent whose child had wandered too close to the misty banks at dusk. The locals spoke of a crocodile who had inhabited these waters for generations, a creature who wasn't merely a predator but a guardian of riddles that could twist the mind like the river twisted through the valley. When the parent discovered their child missing, they followed tiny footprints to the water's edge where they abruptly disappeared. The normally calm waters rippled, and from beneath the surface emerged the crocodile, its ancient eyes reflecting the first emerging stars of twilight. Between its powerful jaws, unharmed but unable to escape, was the child. "I will make you a promise," the crocodile spoke, its voice surprisingly gentle yet tinged with cunning. "If you can predict what I will do next, I shall return your child to you. But be careful with your words, for they may trap you as surely as I have trapped your little one." The riverbank seemed to transform as the conversation began. Fireflies emerged from the tall grasses, their gentle illumination creating a dreamlike quality to the scene. The water flowed with unusual tranquility, almost as if the river itself was listening to the exchange. Mist rose from the water's surface, wrapping around both figures like a veil between worlds. The parent considered the crocodile's words carefully. "You will return my child," they stated, watching the crocodile's expression for any reaction. The crocodile's eyes narrowed. "Now we have a problem. If I do return your child, then your prediction was correct, and by the terms of our agreement, I must return them. But if I had intended to keep your child, your prediction would be wrong, yet to prove it wrong, I would need to keep the child, which would then make your prediction incorrect." The parent felt a cold realization wash over them. "And if I predict that you will not return my child? Then if I intended to keep your child, your prediction would be correct, requiring me to return them, which would make your prediction wrong. But if I returned them, your prediction would be false, meaning I should keep your child, creating an endless circle of contradiction." Time seemed to stand still along the misty riverbank. The parent and crocodile regarded each other in silence, their figures reflected in the gently flowing water between them. The child remained quiet, perhaps understanding instinctively the gravity of this strange confrontation. The fireflies continued their silent dance, illuminating the scene in soft, pulsing light that made everything feel suspended between reality and dream. Sweat beaded on the parent's forehead despite the cool evening air. Every logical path led to contradiction. If the child's fate rested on finding a correct prediction, then no solution existed. The crocodile had constructed a perfect trap, one where the rules themselves ensured failure. The parent looked into the crocodile's ancient eyes and began to see beyond the surface puzzle. This wasn't merely about logic or predictions, but about the nature of promises themselves. What does it mean to make a promise that, by its very structure, cannot be fulfilled? What value is there in an agreement designed to be broken? In that moment of clarity, the parent realized something profound. The crocodile's riddle represented more than a logical trap. It reflected real situations where agreements are built on flawed premises, where contracts contain impossible conditions, where promises are made that cannot be kept. Like political pledges constructed around conflicting goals or relationships founded on incompatible expectations, the paradox exposed the fragility of trust itself. The parent took a deep breath. When they finally spoke, it wasn't to offer a prediction about the crocodile's actions. Instead, they began telling a story. Once there was a village suffering a terrible drought, the parent said, their voice gaining strength. A stranger arrived claiming to possess the power to make it rain but demanded payment first. The villagers, desperate for water, asked how they could trust someone they'd never met. The stranger replied that trust wasn't necessary, only payment. But one elder understood that without trust, no relationship could flourish, and without relationship, no true help could come. The crocodile's eyes remained fixed on the parent, but something in their reptilian gaze shifted almost imperceptibly. The elder offered neither payment nor blind trust, but something more valuable, understanding. "I see you are hungry and tired from your journey," the elder told the stranger. "Before we discuss rain or payment, let us first tend to your immediate needs." This simple act of compassion, seeing the person behind the demand, transformed their interaction. The stranger eventually did bring rain, not because of payment, but because connection had replaced transaction. The parent took a step closer to the water's edge. "Your paradox reveals something important about promises and predictions. Sometimes the solution isn't found in cleverness, but in changing the nature of the relationship itself." The crocodile remained silent, its expression unreadable. "I won't predict what you'll do," the parent continued softly, "because this isn't about outsmarting you. My child isn't a prize to be won through logical gymnastics. They're a person, just as you are more than a puzzle maker. Behind your riddle, I see someone who perhaps has been alone for a very long time, testing humans not because you want to hurt them, but because you're curious if anyone can understand the deeper truth." The fireflies seemed to gather more densely around them, their light reflecting in the crocodile's eyes. The mist thickened, blurring the boundaries between water and air, between parent and predator, between certainty and possibility. "The truth is," the parent said, their voice barely above a whisper, "some paradoxes can't be solved with logic. They can only be transcended through understanding." For what seemed like an eternity, silence reigned along the riverbank. Then slowly, the crocodile's jaws opened. The child scrambled free and ran into their parents' waiting arms. The crocodile didn't speak again, but slipped beneath the water's surface, leaving hardly a ripple behind. Later, villagers would claim they sometimes saw the crocodile watching from the reeds, no longer threatening but seemingly contemplative. Some said the parents' words had awakened something long dormant in the ancient creature, not through clever reasoning but through the recognition of its existence beyond the puzzle it presented. The Infinite Hotel, a doorway to endless dreams. Far beyond the crocodile's river, where the edges of dreams blend with the fabric of mathematical curiosity, stands a structure unlike any other. This isn't a building constrained by the laws of physics or the limitations of finite space. It's Hilbert's Grand Hotel, a place where the concept of no vacancy has no meaning even when every single room is occupied. The impossible becomes possible here, as infinity itself becomes not just a concept but an experience. The Dreamkeeper stands at the ornate reception desk, their form slightly translucent as if made from the same substance as moonlight. Their hands move gracefully across an endless ledger that somehow fits on the marble countertop, tracking the infinite guests who reside within these walls. The Dreamkeeper's eyes reflect countless stars, for they've witnessed the birth and death of dreams since time immemorial. Every room contains a different dream, the Dreamkeeper explains to no one in particular, their voice like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Some rooms hold adventures of flight, others the warm embrace of forgotten memories, and still others contain dreams not yet dreamed by any living soul. The hotel itself defies conventional architecture. Corridors extend in gentle curves that somehow never intersect despite seemingly occupying the same space. Staircases float without visible support, their steps materializing just as a foot requires them. Doorways shimmer like portals, each numbered with perfect clarity, yet the numbers stretch into infinity without ever becoming too small to read. On this particular night, a rare occurrence has happened. the Infinite Hotel is completely full. Every numbered room contains a dreamer from room 1 to room infinity. The ledger shows no vacancies, with each guest's name written in script that changes color as the dreamkeeper's gaze passes over it. Just as the clock strikes midnight, the doors to the hotel swing open, revealing a weary traveler silhouetted against the starlit sky. Their shoulders slump with exhaustion, eyes heavy with the weight of wakefulness. The traveler approaches the desk, footsteps echoing on marble floors that seem to extend in all directions at once. "I seek rest," the traveler says simply, "and perhaps a beautiful dream to carry me until morning." The dreamkeeper smiles, not at all concerned by the full ledger before them. "Of course, we always have room for one more dreamer." The traveler's brow furrows, but surely there's no space if every room is occupied. Without answering directly, the dreamkeeper reaches for a bell on the counter and rings it once. The sound resonates throughout the infinite structure, not growing fainter with distance but maintaining its perfect clarity as it travels down every corridor and staircase. "I've asked each guest to move to the room numbered 1 higher than their current room," the dreamkeeper explains. The guest in room 1 moves to room 2, the guest in room 2 moves to room 3, and so on. Since we have an infinite number of rooms, every guest still has a place to stay. The traveler watches in amazement as doors throughout the hotel open simultaneously. Guests step out into the hallways, carrying their dreams with them like glowing lanterns in the night. Each dream has its own hue, some golden with joy, others blue with melancholy, still others green with the growth of new possibilities. The guests move in perfect harmony, a choreographed dance of infinite movement. "But where does the person in the last room go?" asks the traveler. "Surely there must be an endpoint." The dreamkeeper's laugh is like distant silver bells. "There is no last room in an infinite hotel. That's the beauty of it. The sequence continues forever, so every guest simply moves one room higher in an unending chain." As the guests settle into their new rooms, the dreamkeeper leads the traveler toward room 1, now empty and waiting. But before they reach it, the doors swing open once more. This time, not a single traveler enters, but an infinite procession of them, an entire bus filled with countless weary dreamers seeking shelter. The traveler gasps. "Surely now we've reached the limit. You've accommodated me, but an infinite number of new guests? It's impossible." "Nothing is impossible in the realm of infinity," the dreamkeeper responds, ringing the bell twice this time. "Now I've asked each current guest to move to the room numbered double their previous room number. The guest from room 1 goes to room 2, the guest from room 2 goes to room 4, the guest from room 3 goes to room 6. The traveler watches as the hotel shifts again, doors opening and closing in perfect synchronicity. But why does that help? "Because now all the odd-numbered rooms are empty," explains the dreamkeeper. "Room 1, room 3, room 5, and so on. Infinitely many rooms, all vacant. Each new guest from the bus can take an odd-numbered room, and we still have perfect accommodation for everyone." The mathematics of infinity unfolds before the traveler's eyes as guests from the bus file in, each carrying their own unique dreams waiting to be experienced. Some dreams are ancient, recycled through countless minds over centuries, while others are brand new, never before conceived until this very moment. At last, when all the new guests have been accommodated, the dreamkeeper returns to the traveler. "And now your room awaits. Room 1 is prepared for you." The traveler follows, curiosity building about what dream might be waiting. Throughout their journey down the corridor, they pass room after room, hearing soft murmurs of dreams in progress, laughter from some, gentle weeping from others, and occasional gasps of wonder. When they reach room 1, the dreamkeeper opens the door with a flourish. Inside, the room appears to be empty except for a single object in the center, a mirror that stretches from floor to ceiling, its frame adorned with mathematical symbols and equations representing infinity. "I don't understand," says the traveler, stepping closer to the mirror. "Where is the dream?" "Look closely," the dreamkeeper urges. In the mirror, the traveler sees not just their own reflection, but infinite versions of themselves stretching into the distance, each slightly different, some younger, some older, some taking paths in life the traveler had never considered. Your dream is the most infinite of all, the Dreamkeeper explains, for within each of us exists endless possibilities, countless versions of ourselves and the lives we might lead. The infinity of the hotel exists not just in its rooms, but in each dreamer who rests within its walls. The traveler reaches toward the mirror, fingers almost touching those of their reflection. So, I contain infinity just as this hotel does? Precisely, the Dreamkeeper nods. Just as adding more guests to an infinite hotel doesn't increase its size, adding more days to your life doesn't change the boundless potential within you. Infinity is not merely endless quantity, it's a different quality of existence altogether. As the traveler settles onto the bed facing the mirror, their eyelids grow heavy. The Dreamkeeper moves toward the door, pausing only to add, "Tonight you'll explore the infinite hotel of your own consciousness. Every door within you leads to another room, another possibility, another dream." The Cosmic Observer, Schrödinger's Star. While the Dreamkeeper's words echo through the traveler's slumber across the universe, a different kind of paradox unfolds in the quiet dome of an old observatory. Astronomer Elias has spent countless nights beneath its cracked glass ceiling, his eyes fixed on a peculiar star that defies conventional understanding. Unlike the predictable celestial bodies he's documented throughout his career, this distant pinpoint of light behaves in ways that challenge everything he thought he knew about the cosmos. The star first caught Elias's attention during a routine sky survey when his instruments detected an anomaly. The distant sun appeared to exist in two contradictory states simultaneously, brilliantly burning and completely extinguished, but only when he wasn't directly observing it. The moment Elias trained his telescope on the star, it settled into a single definite state, as if aware of his attention. Elias's observatory sits atop a forgotten mountain, far from city lights. The wooden floors creak with each step, and the massive telescope at its center, a relic from the previous century, stands like a sentinel against the mysteries of space. A worn leather chair beside it bears the impression of Elias's form, shaped by years of vigilant stargazing. A small desk cluttered with notebooks and star charts occupies the corner, the pages filled with observations and questions about his cosmic puzzle. "It's as if the star exists in multiple realities until I look at it," Elias mumbles to himself, stroking his graying beard as he adjusts the telescope's position. The concept reminds him of something he once read about quantum superposition, where subatomic particles exist in multiple states until measured or observed. But stars aren't quantum particles. They're massive collections of matter. How could something so enormous exhibit behavior previously only observed in the tiniest components of reality? Night after night, Elias developed experiments to test his observations. He set up automated cameras to capture the star when he wasn't looking, only to find the images showing a blur, neither clearly alive nor dead, but something in between. When he programmed his telescope to automatically focus on the star at random intervals, the data showed the star instantly resolving into a single state the moment the telescope's lens captured it. Am I causing this effect by observing it? Elias wonders aloud to the empty dome. Or am I simply collapsing possibilities into a single reality? The question haunts him as he sips lukewarm tea from a chipped mug. The line between observer and observed begins to blur in his mind as the nights stretch into weeks. The ancient telescope creaks as Elias makes minute adjustments. The brass fittings, polished by generations of astronomers before him, reflect the soft glow of his desk lamp. Outside, an owl hoots, reminding him that he exists in a world apart from the distant star, or does he? As his fascination with the star deepens, the boundaries between Elias's consciousness and the cosmos he studies begin to dissolve. On particularly clear nights, when the star shimmers with unusual brightness, Elias feels a strange connection forming. The more he watches the star, the more he begins to wonder if it's somehow watching him back. The universe, once a cold expanse of predictable physical laws, now seems alive with possibility and awareness. Perhaps observation itself is a form of interaction, he whispers to the telescope. Perhaps the very act of looking changes both the observer and the observed. The thought sends a pleasant shiver down his spine as he realizes he might be participating in a cosmic dance rather than merely documenting it. 3 months into his study of the paradoxical star, Elias notices something even more peculiar about himself. When he's not actively focusing on a particular thought or memory, they seem to exist in multiple versions simultaneously, like his mysterious star. Only when he directly examines a thought does it solidify into a single narrative or image. Could my consciousness operate on similar principles? He wonders, adjusting the focus knob. Are my thoughts in a state of quantum superposition until I observe them? The parallel between his mind and the distant star becomes increasingly compelling as the boundary between inner and outer space fades. As dawn approaches one morning, Elias makes a decision. Instead of trying to resolve the paradox, he will embrace it. Settling into his leather chair, he closes his eyes and attempts something he's never done before, to hold in his mind all possible states of the star simultaneously without forcing it into a single reality. The experience is disorienting at first. His trained scientific mind rebels against the ambiguity, wanting to categorize and define. But gradually, Elias learns to hold the contradiction gently, the star both burning and extinguished, both alive and dead, both distant and intimately connected to him. Reality isn't fixed until we interact with it, he realizes. And even then, we're only experiencing one possibility among many. The thought doesn't frustrate him as it once might have. Instead, it fills him with a profound sense of wonder at the mysterious dialogue between consciousness and the cosmos. On what becomes the final night of his obsessive study, Elias sits before his telescope but doesn't look through it. Instead, he gazes at the night sky with his naked eyes, seeing the distant star as just one point among millions. He understands now that his relationship with the star has changed him fundamentally. The beauty isn't in knowing definitively, he says to the empty observatory. It's in participating in the dance between observer and observed, between certainty and possibility. For the first time in months, Elias feels peace wash over him. The need to resolve the paradox has dissolved into something greater, an appreciation for the mystery itself. As he finally drifts toward sleep in his chair, the first light of dawn filtering through the dome, Elias smiles at the realization that has transformed his understanding of existence. The universe isn't a collection of definite objects existing independently of observation. It's a web of possibilities that crystallize only through interaction and relationship. Conclusion: the paradox of sleep itself. As we reach the end of our paradoxical journey, it's worth noting that sleep itself represents perhaps the most fascinating paradox of all. Think about it. The harder you try to witness yourself falling asleep, the more it eludes you. Sleep requires a surrender that defies our natural instinct to maintain control and awareness. The boundary between wakefulness and dreams isn't a clear line, but rather a fluid transition where consciousness gradually transforms into something else entirely. This mysterious threshold between states reminds us that not everything in our experience needs to be categorized or solved. Just as philosophers have suggested, this liminal space resists our attempts to pin it down through rational analysis. To enter the realm of dreams, we must release our grip on certainty and allow our thoughts to drift without direction or purpose. There's a certain poetry in this surrender, a weightlessness that comes when we stop trying to understand and simply experience the gentle current carrying us towards sleep. In this space of not quite awake and not fully asleep, we find the perfect resolution to our paradoxical tales. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved but experienced.